Hello there, and welcome to this special boring history episode on the rather disturbing lives of the pharaohs in ancient Egypt. If you're looking for a calming and thought-provoking historical story to carry you off to dreamland, you've come to the right place. Before we begin our journey back in time, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time of day it is for you right now. Feel free to leave a comment and say hello. And if you enjoy this type of relaxing, educational content, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Alright, let's set the stage, shall we? Imagine a land of golden deserts, lush river valleys, and monumental temples and tombs that pierce the vivid blue sky. A civilization that endured for over 3,000 years, leaving an indelible mark on human history. At the center of it all were the pharaohs, the divine rulers who wielded immense power and prestige. But behind the glittering facade of riches and royalty, the lives of these god-kings were often steeped in darkness, obsession, and shocking practices that may be hard for us to fathom today. Over the next hour or so, we'll be diving deep into the fascinating and often unsettling world of ancient Egyptian pharaohs. We'll explore their opulent daily lives inside sprawling palace complexes, their tangled webs of royal relationships and rivalries, and their unshakable belief in their own divinity. We'll also confront the pharaohs' fixation on death and the afterlife, which drove them to construct ever more elaborate tombs and funerary temples, and even led some to engage in the chilling practice of human sacrifice. By the end of our journey, we'll have encountered influential figures like Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, King Tut, and Ramses II, and trace the captivating mysteries modern archaeologists are still unraveling about their lives and times. It's a story of power, magic, obsession, and eternal legacies that have enthralled the world for centuries. So dim the lights, settle in, and let the intrigues of ancient Egypt softly whisk you away on the wings of history. But before we fully immerse ourselves in the distant past, let's first zoom out and take in ancient Egyptian civilization at its height. Stretching from around 3100 BCE to 30 BCE, ancient Egypt was one of the first and longest-lasting complex societies in human history. The kingdom was born when King Menes unified the disparate tribes of the lush Nile Valley into a single state, taking advantage of the river's fertile floodplains to fuel an agricultural revolution that would be the envy of the ancient world. Over the centuries, Egypt grew into a powerhouse of wealth, culture, and influence, its lands stretching from the Mediterranean Sea to deep into Nubia in the south. The pharaohs presided over a centralized state with a sophisticated bureaucracy, groundbreaking technological advancements like the ox-drawn plough and sailboats, and a rich culture that produced timeless works of art, architecture, and literature. The Egyptians developed one of the world's earliest writing systems in the form of hieroglyphics, as well as a 365-day calendar that tracked the annual flooding of the Nile with uncanny precision. But perhaps their most visible and enduring achievements were the colossal monuments they left behind: the Great Pyramids, sprawling temple complexes, and subterranean tombs hewn into cliffsides. These awe-inspiring feats of engineering served to project the godlike power and prestige of the pharaohs, while also hinting at the depths of their obsession with death and eternity. For the pharaohs, this earthly life was but a prelude to a glorious and well-provisioned immortality, and they would bend immense resources and human capital to securing their share of forever. At the center of this remarkable civilization were the pharaohs themselves, the divine kings who ruled as the living embodiment of the god Horus on earth. The pharaoh was the supreme authority in all matters of state, religion, and war, wielding a level of power and influence that would be almost unimaginable today. He, or in rare cases she, was responsible for maintaining order and balance in the cosmos, placating the gods with rituals and offerings, and ensuring the prosperity and protection of the Egyptian people. But this exalted status came with a dark side as well. As we'll soon discover, the pharaohs were bound by an intricate and often brutal web of rituals, superstitions, and obligations that governed every aspect of their lives and deaths. From the incestuous marriages they contracted to keep the royal bloodline pure, to the servants and pets they took with them into the grave, to the shocking acts of deification and human sacrifice some pharaohs engaged in, the lives of these divine rulers were often steeped in as much darkness as light. So, as we set off to explore the private lives and enduring legacy of some of history's most iconic and influential rulers, brace yourself for a journey into the captivating, beguiling, and at times disturbing world of the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. Let's begin by imagining a day in the life of a pharaoh at the height of the New Kingdom, around 1500 BCE. Dawn breaks gently over the shining limestone walls of the pharaoh's sprawling palace complex at Thebes. The king and his entourage are roused from their sleep by the soft sound of blind musicians serenading the sunrise, as barefoot servants pad silently through torch-lit halls, bearing trays of delicacies to break the royal fast. In the palace's colonnaded courtyards, songbirds flit among lush gardens and burbling fountains as tame baboons and lion cubs lounge in the shade. The pharaoh emerges from his bedchamber accompanied by a coterie of body servants who have spent the last hour attending to his elaborate grooming regimen. They've shaved his head and body silky smooth to stave off lice, lined his eyes with striking kohl and green malachite, and anointed his limbs with fragrant oils and perfumes. Gold and electrum gleam at his throat and wrists, while an exquisite crown in the shape of a falcon encircles his brow, a symbol of his divine kinship with the god Horus. Thus arrayed in all his finery, the living god strides forth to begin his packed schedule of daily duties and devotions. First on the agenda is a visit to the palace shrine to make offerings and libations to the chief gods, Re the sun god, Osiris the god of the underworld, and the pharaoh's own deified ancestors. Chanting priests fill the incense-perfumed air with hymns and prayers, as the king prostrates himself before the serene painted gazes of the gods. With his religious obligations discharged, the pharaoh convenes his council to hear petitions, dispense judgments, and consult on affairs of state. Seated on a golden throne, he listens as his vizier reads out the day's business. Boundary disputes to settle, trade agreements to negotiate, construction projects to oversee. Though he solicits advice from his most trusted courtiers, the final word on all matters ultimately rests with him. The day wears on in a blur of ceremonies and spectacles designed to awe the populace and reinforce the pharaoh's divine right to rule. The king processes through the city in a magnificent chariot, the cheers of his subjects rising like a wave as he showers them with gifts of gold and grain. He officiates over the ritual opening of a new temple, driving in the first peg with a golden mallet as priests chant incantations to seal the sacred space. But even in these moments of public triumph, an undercurrent of dark superstition and obsessive ritual runs beneath the surface. The pharaoh is careful to always enter a room right foot first to ward off evil spirits. He eats only with his left hand, reserving his right for communing with the gods. And he never, ever allows his shadow to fall across a priest or a statue of a deity, lest he incur divine wrath that could bring ruin upon the kingdom. As Re's fiery orb sinks slowly toward the western horizon, the pharaoh retires to his private quarters for a few snatched moments of relaxation before the evening banquet. Lithe dancing girls sway sinuously to the strains of harps and lyres, while the king sips date wine from a golden goblet and contemplates the finer points of theology with his advisors. But even in repose, the spectre of death and eternity are never far from his mind. For the pharaoh knows that this mortal life, however opulent and godlike, is but a fleeting dream compared to the glorious forever that awaits him in the field of reeds. It's why he's already poured untold resources into his tomb in the Valley of the Kings, a hidden city of the dead, where he will reign in splendor for all eternity. But first, he must navigate the tangled web of obligations and dangers that come with wearing the double crown. And nowhere are those perils more present than in his own royal household. From the day he ascends the throne, one of the pharaoh's most pressing duties is to secure the succession by producing a male heir. But in the incestuous hothouse of the royal family, where pharaohs routinely wed their siblings and even their own children to keep the bloodline pure, the battle for power and influence is always seething just beneath the gilded surface. The king's great royal wife may be his half-sister, but that doesn't stop her from plotting with priests and courtiers to advance her own son's claim to the throne over that of his older half-brother. Indeed, the annals of Egyptian history are littered with tales of palace intrigue, rival queens, and ruthless power plays between potential heirs. Take the remarkable story of Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh who ruled as king in her own right for over 20 years in the 15th century BCE. Though she was originally just a regent for her young stepson Thutmose III, Hatshepsut slowly consolidated power, adopting all the masculine trappings of kingship, and even depicting herself with a beard in official artwork. Or consider the shocking tale of the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, who upended centuries of religious tradition by proclaiming the sun disk Aten as the one true god and outlawing the worship of all others. In his religious zeal, Akhenaten even changed his name from Amenhotep IV to reflect his devotion to Aten, moved the capital to a remote desert city, and persecuted the powerful priests of Amun. His reign was plagued by palace conspiracies and ended in disaster, with his young son Tutankhamun left to pick up the pieces. But perhaps the most disturbing example of how the pharaoh's godlike power could be abused is the practice of human sacrifice that was once disturbingly common in ancient Egypt. Archaeologists have unearthed numerous so-called retainer sacrifices in the tombs of early kings like Jer and Jet, where dozens of servants were slaughtered to continue serving their master in the afterlife. Even more chillingly, some pharaohs like Aha were buried with their pets and worldly treasures, as well as piles of human hair wigs, likely shorn from sacrificial victims. Thankfully, this ghastly practice seems to have died out by the end of the Old Kingdom, as the Egyptians developed more symbolic ways for pharaohs to take their earthly entourage with them into the afterlife. But it remains a dark stain on the otherwise glittering legacy of the pharaohs, a reminder of the unfathomable gulf that separated these divine kings from the teeming masses they ruled over. As the centuries roll on, the pharaohs continue to shape the course of Egyptian history and leave their mark in stone and story. Some, like Ramses II, known as Ramses the Great, presided over the kingdom at the height of its power and splendor, their triumphs and love lives immortalized on the walls of the temples they built to their own glory. Others, like the fabled Cleopatra VII, became entangled in the high-stakes intrigues of the wider Mediterranean world, their personal charisma and political savvy the stuff of enduring legend. But perhaps no pharaoh has captured the modern imagination quite like the boy King Tutankhamun, whose lavish tomb discovery in 1922 set off a global wave of Tutmania and turned the once obscure ruler into a household name. The dazzling treasures found in Tut's tomb, from his iconic golden death mask to the nested coffins and thrones, provided an unprecedented glimpse into the opulence and artistry of a royal burial and cemented the pharaoh's reputation as the ultimate status symbols of the ancient world. Today, new archaeological discoveries and cutting-edge scientific techniques are allowing us to peer even deeper into the lives and deaths of these endlessly fascinating rulers. CT scans and DNA analysis have revealed the inbred genetic deformities that plagued Tut's family line, as well as the festering wounds and malaria that likely claimed his life at the tender age of 19th. Inscriptions and papyri paint an increasingly vivid picture of the cutthroat world of palace politics, where foreign concubines and scheming viziers jostled for influence in the shadow of the throne. And yet, for all the dark secrets and unsettling practices we've uncovered about the pharaohs, their luminous legacy as some of the most iconic and enduring rulers in human history remains undimmed. For over 3,000 years, they presided over a civilization of remarkable achievements and innovations, from the mathematical precision of the pyramids to the medical know-how of the world's first brain surgery. They inspired some of the most sublime and enduring works of art and architecture ever created, from the serene beauty of Nefertiti's limestone bust to the colossal majesty of the Colossi of Memnon. And they continue to fire our imaginations and tug at our sense of wonder, inviting us to contemplate the mysteries of absolute power and ponder what it means to reach for immortality in the face of the fleeting nature of human life. So the next time you find yourself gazing up at the inscrutable face of the Sphinx or marveling at the golden splendor of Tutankhamun's funerary mask, take a moment to reflect on the pharaohs who once wielded godlike power over the lives of millions. Theirs is a story of dazzling triumphs and shocking abuses, soaring monuments and chilling body counts, unimaginable wealth and existential dread in the face of eternity. It's a story that reminds us of the heights of human achievement and the depths of our capacity for cruelty, the unquenchable thirst for immortality, and the inescapable reality of death. And it's a story that will continue to captivate us as long as the timeless stones of ancient Egypt keep their secrets close, inviting each new generation to unravel anew the endlessly fascinating riddle of the pharaohs. And with that, we've reached the end of our whirlwind tour through the disturbing and dazzling lives of ancient Egyptian pharaohs. I hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most iconic and influential civilizations, and that the stories of these larger-than-life rulers have provided some rich food for thought as you drift off to sleep. As always, thanks so much for tuning in to Boring History, and for spending a portion of your day exploring the endlessly fascinating nooks and crannies of our shared human story. If you've enjoyed this immersive journey into the distant past, I'd be thrilled if you could hit that subscribe button and leave a comment sharing your thoughts on the pharaohs and their far-reaching legacy. Until next time, sweet dreams. And may your reveries be filled with the golden light of the eternal sun disk, the lush reeds of the field of reeds, and the whispered secrets of the kings and queens who once ruled as living gods over the shimmering sands of ancient Egypt. Good night. As we've seen, the pharaohs of ancient Egypt lived lives of opulence and grandeur almost unimaginable today. But behind the glittering facade of gold and gods lay a darker reality, one of unchecked power, mystical obsessions, and the ever-present spectre of death. Perhaps no pharaoh embodied these contradictions more than Ramses II, also known as Ramses the Great. Ascending to the throne around 1279 BC, Ramses would rule for an astonishing 66 years. One of the longest reigns in Egyptian history. He presided over an era of great prosperity and embarked on a massive building campaign, erecting temples, obelisks, and statues across the empire. The sheer scale and grandeur of these monuments were meant to awe his subjects and proclaim his divine power for all eternity. But Ramses II's thirst for glory and immortality knew no bounds. He fathered over 100 children with a vast harem of wives and concubines. He didn't hesitate to deface or outright destroy the temples and monuments of previous rulers, replacing their names and images with his own in a brazen act of propaganda. Even the colossal statues he erected of himself, some towering over 80 feet tall, were exercises in deified narcissism and self-aggrandizement. Yet perhaps most disturbing were the measures Ramses took to ensure his own afterlife. His sprawling tomb complex, the Ramesseum, included a massive funerary temple served by an entire city of priests, artisans, and slaves. Ramses spared no expense furnishing his eternal resting place, packing it with unimaginable treasures, golden chariots, exquisite furniture, intricately carved alabaster vessels. Even his beloved pet lion was mummified to accompany him. But Ramses didn't stop there. Recent excavations suggest that many of the pharaoh's household staff, including his concubines, were ritually sacrificed upon his death so they could continue serving him in the afterlife. The remains of these victims paint a grim picture, their bodies posed as if still waiting hand and foot on their master, now an eternally divine king. It's a chilling reminder of just how far ancient Egyptian rulers were willing to go in their quest for immortality and godlike power. Ramses II may have reigned over a golden age, but he also exploited untold thousands in service of his own vanity and delusions of divinity. The blood and sweat of commoners quite literally built his legacy. While Ramses the Great was a particularly egregious example, he was far from the only pharaoh to abuse his absolute power in such ways. His predecessors, Amenhotep III and Akhenaten, undertook similarly ambitious and self-serving building projects. The boy king Tutankhamun was entombed with a staggering array of priceless treasures, while Cleopatra ruthlessly eliminated her own siblings to secure sole control of the throne. Time and again, the pharaohs proved that their deified status placed them above the moral laws governing ordinary Egyptians. They could upend religious traditions on a whim, take countless sexual partners, seize property and labor, even ritualize murder, all without consequence. The promise of a glorious afterlife made megalomaniacal excess not only acceptable, but almost inevitable. But in the end, the pharaohs discovered what all tyrants must, that no mortal, no matter how powerful, can escape death. For all their temples and tombs, magical spells and sacrificial servants, they succumb to the same fate as the humblest peasant. Their mummified bodies and worldly possessions gathered dust in the darkness, while their empire declined and their gods were forgotten. The cautionary tale of the pharaohs still resonates in our modern world of would-be strongmen and self-styled demigods. Those who believe themselves above the common bonds of morality and mortality would do well to remember how the mightiest rulers of ancient Egypt met their ignominious ends. For the great leveler comes for kings and commoners alike. A humbling lesson, 3,000 years in the making. As we close this chapter on the disturbing lives of ancient Egypt's god-kings, one can't help but marvel at all that's been lost to the devouring sands of time. We may have unearthed their treasures and unraveled some of their secrets. But so much remains unknown about this captivating civilization that built wonders and banished moral constraints. Perhaps, as archaeologists chip away at the layers of history, we'll come to an even clearer understanding of the shadows behind the pharaoh's dazzling reign. A deeper knowledge of what drove these divine rulers to such heights of power and depths of depraved self-obsession. Until then, they'll continue to haunt our imaginations, spectacular, sphinx-like, cloaked in gold and mystery. We can only guess at what other chilling revelations lie buried in the Valley of the Kings, waiting to see the light of day once more. Tales of tyrants and god-kings, faded to dust and etched in eternity. A reminder that even the grandest of empires and most glorified of rulers can't escape time's inexorable march. So, as we drift off to sleep, our heads filled with gilded sarcophagi and whispering spirits. Let's ponder the enduring allure of these ancient royals who held the power of life and death, heaven and earth, in their manicured hands, and be thankful perhaps that their like will never walk among us again, divine, decadent, and undone by their own towering egos. The next morning would see the pharaoh embark on his daily routine of religious duties and governing. He would first bathe in a sacred pool or be cleansed with holy water by priests, a ritual believed to purify both body and spirit. The pharaoh was then dressed in the finest linens, adorned with regal symbols like the double crown, scepter, and crook. Each item held deep meaning, the crook representing his role as shepherd of his people, the flail his authority to punish enemies of Egypt. But even these mundane morning tasks were imbued with layers of spiritual significance. Every movement was like a carefully choreographed dance, governed by the strict rules of Ma'at, the cosmic order that held the universe together. To deviate even slightly from these divine protocols was to court chaos and risk the god's wrath. It was a heavy existential burden to bear, but one seen as absolutely essential for a living god. Once attired in his divine regalia, the pharaoh would emerge from the palace to begin his packed schedule. Often first up was a visit to the temple to make offerings to the gods and perform vital rituals. As the high priest of every temple, his role was to gratify the gods and secure their continued blessings for Egypt. He would deliver offerings, recite sacred spells, and burn incense to the cult statues in the temple sanctuary. No matter how tedious, each rite had to be performed with perfect precision, like maintaining a cosmic engine. Even the subtlest mistake could have catastrophic consequences. The famous pyramid texts, carved on the walls of royal tombs, were essentially a script for the pharaoh to follow in the afterlife, guiding him through the trials to reach the blessed field of reeds. One can only imagine the intense pressure and anxiety of having to execute the rituals flawlessly, with the highest stakes imaginable riding on them. With his religious duties complete, the pharaoh would turn to the business of governing Egypt. He would meet with his most trusted advisors, viziers who acted as his eyes and ears throughout the land. They delivered reports on the political situation in Egypt and its diplomatic ties with rivals like the Nubians, Hittites, and Mesopotamians. The pharaoh would hear petitions from his people and pronounce his judgments according to Ma'at. Although the viziers oversaw the vast state bureaucracy on a day-to-day basis, the pharaoh had the final say on all matters and was expected to uphold justice. Governing a massive state was challenging enough, but the pharaoh's absolute power created its own disturbing incentives. With no real check on his whims, a pharaoh could easily succumb to corruption or tyranny if he wished. Some pharaohs imposed brutal taxes and forced labor on their subjects to build their own lavish monuments. Others grew paranoid and resorted to ruthless purges of anyone they perceived as a threat. The Ptolemaic pharaoh Ptolemy IV had his own mother and brother murdered to eliminate potential rivals to the throne. With ultimate power over life and death, even the bonds of family could turn deadly. But the pharaoh's day wasn't all blood and toil. He was also entitled to enjoy the finest earthly pleasures and leisure pursuits. He might go on a hunting expedition in the desert, firing arrows from his war chariot at fleeing lions and gazelles. The hunt was seen as a metaphor for the pharaoh's triumph over the forces of chaos that constantly threatened Egypt. A successful hunt proved his vitality and warrior prowess. The pharaoh might also indulge in a board game of senet with one of his trusted courtiers. Senet was hugely popular among the Egyptian elite and even took on spiritual dimensions. Some believed the game mimicked the soul's journey through the Duat underworld, with the final squares representing the gates of the afterlife. Here again, The lines between earthly recreation and cosmic symbolism were always blurred. As Re's journey across the sky drew to a close and shadows lengthened, the pharaoh would finally retire to his chambers after a long day of service to the two lands. But even in rest, his divine duties never ceased. The pharaoh's sleep was believed to mystically merge his Ba soul with the sun god, renewing his divine life force. It was a time of strange visions and communion with the gods, not mere repose. Enigmatic dream books have survived that were used to help interpret the pharaoh's dreams and discern divine messages in them. In one disturbing dream from the Chester Beatty Papyrus, the pharaoh Ramses II dreamt he saw Ptah, the great creator god of Memphis, standing over him with a sword. Ptah angrily chastised him for not completing his temple and struck him on his side. When Ramses awoke, he was determined to appease the wrathful deity by expediting work on the temple. Even in his own dreams, it seemed, there was no refuge from the crushing pressure of his role. The pharaoh's waking hours may have passed according to strict ritual and protocol, but his sleeping mind was an untamed landscape where deities and demons roamed freely. The same potent magic he wielded by day held sway in this nocturnal realm, for good or ill. Spells were carved on headrests and bed frames to protect the vulnerable sleeper from malign forces. This liminal space between waking and dreaming was a potent time for communing with the unseen and for divining the gods' mercurial wills. The life of a pharaoh, from sunup to sundown, was a tightrope walk between the earthly and divine, the banal and sublime. Every action, no matter how routine, took on transcendent significance. In a world pulsing with magic and portent, there could be no real distinction between sacred and profane. That pervasive aura of mysticism and symbolism infused the pharaoh's day-to-day existence, but also justified the absolute power he wielded. By upholding Ma'at in the material realm, the pharaoh sustained the proper order that kept the cosmos from dissolving into oblivion. But that same power also enabled the darkest impulses and excesses of human nature. The challenge for any pharaoh was to embody the lofty virtues of a god on earth, while still being fallible flesh and blood. Some managed that balancing act with justice and restraint, securing their people's prosperity and history's favor. Others succumbed to tyranny and caprice, leaving legacies forever tainted by cruelty. But whether revered or reviled, the pharaohs all shared an existence profoundly alien to our modern sensibilities, where the scope of one's actions held literally life and death stakes for an entire civilization. The pharaoh's day typically began at sunrise with a ceremonial cleansing by priests, followed by a grand procession out to the main temple for ritual offerings and worship. As a living god, this direct link to the divine was the pharaoh's most vital duty, necessary to maintain Ma'at. He would present statuettes of himself as offerings and libate wine, milk, and other precious liquids before the gods. Incense would be burned, prayers recited, and sacred magic enacted through liturgies and hymns. After the morning rituals, the pharaoh would attend to the business of state, receiving ministers' reports, settling legal cases, and issuing decrees on everything from irrigation projects to mining expeditions. He would also engage in more ceremonial duties as the day progressed, from officiating over agricultural festivals to commissioning monumental building works in his name. The pharaoh's workday was interspersed with breaks for meals, recreation, and rest. Meals were sumptuous affairs, with the pharaoh entitled to the choicest cuts of meat, the freshest produce from palace gardens, and delicacies like honey, figs, and dates. Servants would swat flies with long fans and offer water to wash. Recreation might include hunting, board games like Senet, or watching performances by musicians, dancers, and acrobats. Some pharaohs enjoyed swimming in palace pools, or taking a languorous barge ride down the Nile. But even in leisure, there was little respite from ritual and responsibility. If the pharaoh opted for a pleasure cruise, it would be aboard a gilded barge hung with fluttering pennants, rowed by crews of servants as he relaxed under a canopy with his family and courtiers. If he retired to his harem for the evening, he was still expected to spend time with his great royal wife and produce heirs to secure the dynasty. The God King's life was a goldfish bowl of relentless public scrutiny and expectation. While the pharaoh's magnificent surroundings and godlike status may seem enviable, it was in truth an intensely demanding and precarious existence. The smallest lapse in upholding Marat, whether ritual or moral, could unleash the furies of fate upon the entire land. He was like an acrobat crossing the Nile on a gossamer thread, poised between the earthly and the eternal. The burden of his office was an exhausting marathon of pageantry and weighty decisions, with the highest possible stakes in play. As the pharaoh finally retired for the evening, borne aloft on a gilded palanquin to his royal bedchamber, the day's exertions would take their toll. Falling into a dreamless sleep, he could at last slip the yoke of ritual and protocol, however briefly. In the morning, the great wheel would turn once more, and the demigod would re-emerge to greet the rising sun. But in those darkest hours before dawn, the pharaoh's chamber was a hushed sanctum of shadows and murmuring breaths, of stillness and quiet. Here, in night's forgiving embrace, he was merely human once more. Royal relationships and rivalries. The ancient Egyptian royal court was a hothouse of political intrigue, power plays, and Machiavellian machinations. At its apex was the pharaoh himself, the nucleus around which courtiers, officials, priests, and supplicants all revolved like planets around the sun. But the pharaoh was far from alone in his gilded cage. From incestuous marriages to murderous feuds, the intimate relationships and seething rivalries of the royal household were an eternal wellspring of drama to rival any soap opera. The women who surrounded the pharaoh were some of the most influential and intriguing figures in the palace. Foremost among them was the great royal wife, the queen who was meant to be the pharaoh's favorite consort and chief partner in ruling Egypt. Many queens wielded substantial power in their own right, with some like Nefertiti and Hatshepsut even eclipsing their husband's authority. Nefertiti, the legendary beauty and great royal wife of the oddball pharaoh Akhenaten, may have reigned as a full-fledged co-ruler beside him during the height of the Amarna period's religious upheaval. She vanished mysteriously from the record in Akhenaten's final years, but some tantalizing clues hint that she may have even succeeded him as the shrouded pharaoh Smenkhkare. The jury's still out on that enigma. Hatshepsut's unprecedented power play was even more dramatic. As the royal daughter, wife, and mother of kings, Hatshepsut was uniquely poised to make her move when her young stepson Thutmose III inherited the throne. First serving as his regent, Hatshepsut soon assumed the full titles and regalia of a king in her own right, dropping the feminine endings from her royal name. For over 2 decades, Egypt had a female pharaoh in all but anatomy, dominating a time of immense prosperity and monumental building. Only after her death did Thutmose III emerge from the shadow of his formidable stepmother. But being the pharaoh's chief wife and queen was no guarantee of an easy life. In a polygamous palace, the queen always had to stay on her toes to maintain her influence and guard against rivals. One of the most infamous examples was the bitter war between Ramses II's chief queen Nefertari and the secondary wife Isetnofret, mother of the heir apparent. Court gossip gleefully chronicled how the two powerful women schemed ceaselessly against each other, using everything from lavish banquets to slanderous graffiti to sway the pharaoh's favor. The stakes in this Game of Thrones were immensely high, as queens vied to secure the succession for their own sons. Isetnofret ultimately triumphed, living to see her son Meneptah take the throne, but only after decades of cutthroat intrigue. Such vicious rivalries between a pharaoh's wives were par for the palace course. Incest was another queasy quirk of royal marriages, seen as essential to safeguarding the sacred bloodline. Pharaohs often married their sisters, daughters, and even mothers in an attempt to keep the royal lineage as pure as possible. The Greek Ptolemaic dynasty took this to extremes, with the family tree knotting back on itself in a snarled tangle of repeated incestuous unions. Cleopatra VII, the most famous Ptolemy of all, was actually the product of at least 3 generations of uninterrupted brother-sister marriages. Her family seemed to be competing to rack up the most convoluted incestuous relationships, with uncle-niece and even double-sibling matches thrown in for good measure. Ironically, all this incestuous inbreeding may have produced the genetic quirks and mental instability that ultimately doomed the dynasty. But incest in the royal family wasn't just a Ptolemaic phenomenon. It was an age-old custom dating back to the mythical origins of Egyptian kingship itself. The pharaoh was seen as the earthly embodiment of Horus, the divine son of Osiris and Isis, a brother-sister pair who also happened to be husband and wife. By emulating the gods' incestuous marriage, the pharaoh was upholding the cosmic order and literally following in the footsteps of the gods. Of course, such sibling marriages must have taken a heavy toll, both psychologically and genetically. The famous Tutankhamun was the sickly, short-lived product of an incestuous match between Akhenaten and his sister. His congenitally deformed foot and cleft palate point to the deleterious effects of inbreeding. But to the ancient Egyptians, purity of blood was far more important than genetic diversity. Incest was therefore not a taboo, but a sacred tradition. If rivalries between wives were vicious, those between potential heirs could be downright murderous. Primogeniture was not a hard and fast rule in ancient Egypt, meaning that any son or even daughter of the pharaoh could potentially make a play for the throne. This often led to cutthroat power struggles and grim succession crises as rival princes schemed to eliminate their competitors. One notorious example was Amenemhat I, the founder of the powerful 12th dynasty. An advisor to the previous king, Amenemhat launched a successful coup and had himself crowned as the new pharaoh. But his reign was plagued by constant conspiracies and assassination attempts, as rival factions jockeyed for power. His own harem even launched a shadowy plot against his life, creeping into the royal bedchamber with daggers drawn. Amenemhat only survived by the intervention of his loyal guards, fighting them off nearly naked. So shaken was Amenemhat by his brush with death that he took the unprecedented step of crowning his son, Senusret I, as co-pharaoh during his own lifetime. By securing the succession early, Amenemhat aimed to stave off further intrigues and smooth the transfer of power. Realpolitik trumped tradition. Amenemhat's instructions to his son, a treatise on effective kingship, reflect his embattled cynicism. Be on your guard against all subordinates, because you cannot be sure who is plotting against you. Perhaps the ultimate example of a royal rivalry turned deadly was the grim fall of Ramses III, the last great pharaoh of the New Kingdom. Court records paint a sordid picture of a geriatric pharaoh with a harem of hundreds, riven by factionalism as rival wives schemed to put their sons on the throne. One wife, Tiye, hatched an audacious plot to assassinate Ramses and crown her son Pentawere in a coup. The conspiracy was uncovered at the 11th hour, but not before a bloody skirmish between guards loyal to Tiye and those protecting the pharaoh. In the end, Ramses' own throat was slit, likely by an assassin who wormed his way into the royal harem. The king lingered just long enough to appoint his designated heir and round up the ringleaders of the failed coup. In a grisly epilogue, the chief conspirators were forced to commit suicide, while the hapless Pentawere was brutally executed and denied proper burial. Even in death, royal rivalries refused to rest. Such ruthless intrigues and lethal power plays were all too common in the pharaoh's court, where the knives were perpetually out. Trust and loyalty were luxuries few could afford, with even family members potential enemies vying for position. Caught in this tangled web of shaky alliances and seething resentments, the pharaoh had to walk a razor's edge, vigilantly balancing factions while watching his own back. Heavy was the head that wore the double crown. Gods on earth, the pharaoh as divine ruler. More than mere monarchs, the pharaohs of ancient Egypt were living deities, straddling the boundary between the earthly and divine. Each pharaoh was seen as the embodiment of Horus, the falcon-headed sky god, and the son of the great sun god Re, Az. The practice of retainer sacrifice, also known as retainer burial, was one of the most chilling customs in ancient Egypt. The idea was that servants, both human and animal, who attended the pharaoh in life, would continue to serve him in death and the afterlife. This was seen as an honor, to accompany one's king for eternity. But to our modern sensibilities, it's a staggering loss of life in the name of royal luxury. Some of the earliest evidence of retainer sacrifice comes from subsidiary graves around the royal tombs of the First Dynasty pharaohs at Abydos. These subsidiary graves contain the remains of servants, as well as food, furniture, jewelry, and tools, all the things deemed necessary to serve the pharaoh in the afterlife. The tomb of King Djer is a striking example. Excavations revealed 318 subsidiary burials around his tomb, with servants' bodies arranged in neat rows, believed to have been sacrificed upon Djer's death. Even more unsettling are the animal sacrifices found in pharaonic tombs. Many kings were buried with their beloved pets to keep them company, hunting dogs, cats, monkeys, gazelles, and more. But some animal graves are on a whole different scale. The tomb of King Horahar contained 10 donkeys that had carried his funeral gifts. King Nama's tomb held 10 dogs. The First Dynasty Pharaoh Waj was even buried with no less than 12 baboons, creatures considered sacred to the god Thoth. But perhaps the most bizarre burial good of all was human hair, lots and lots of it. Archaeologists uncovered a staggering 30 million animal mummies and 80 tons of human hair in a series of vast catacombs beneath the Temple of Anubis at Saqqara. Much of this hair is believed to have been shorn from servants and offered to the jackal-headed god of embalming as a plea for the deceased pharaoh's safe journey to the afterlife. As staggering as these numbers are, it's important to note that human sacrifice was not constant throughout ancient Egyptian history. It seems to have been practiced only in the early dynastic period, phasing out as mummification and more symbolic burial goods took precedence. By the time of the New Kingdom, human sacrifices had disappeared, replaced by Shabti figurines meant to magically come alive and act as servants in the afterlife. Still, those early royal tombs with their grim galleries of subsidiary burials leave a lasting and haunting impression. They speak to the absolute power of the pharaohs and the value placed on their post-mortem comfort above all else. Even in death, the pharaohs commanded the living. Their sacred status meant their journey to the afterlife was all that mattered, no matter how many had to die to ensure it. This is perhaps best summed up by the inscription on the tomb of the 6th dynasty courtier, Reni the Elder. He proudly describes his role in building the royal tomb, saying, "His Majesty sent me to Ebet to bring the sarcophagus with its lid, and the costly, august pyramidion for the pyramid called Menara Shines and is Beautiful of the Queen. I did it all in the completeness and exactness which His Majesty loves." The pharaoh's eternal resting place was paramount, sparing no expense, effort, or life. But not all pharaohs clung to these dark, sacrificial practices. The reign of Akhenaten, the controversial king who upended Egyptian religion by worshipping only the sun disk Aten, is notable for its lack of evidence of human sacrifice. Akhenaten moved the capital to a new city, Akhetaten, known today as Amarna. Here he built a royal tomb with no subsidiary graves, perhaps signaling a shift in funerary customs to match his religious reforms. However, Akhenaten's changes were short-lived. After his death, his son Tutankhamun and successors returned to the old gods and traditional practices. Tut's own famous tomb, discovered in 1922, was stocked with all the traditional grave goods and mummified remains of his several stillborn daughters. Though not sacrificed in the old way, these children still accompanied him to the afterlife as eternal reminders of his divine blood. And so, even as human sacrifice waned, the pharaonic obsession with the afterlife never did. The mummification process grew ever more elaborate, with pharaohs like Seti the Firm and Ramesses II going to their eternal rest in multi-room, hidden tombs filled with every earthly treasure. They were still meant to live forever as gods among the gods, even if their retinue of ghostly servants was now rendered in wood, clay, and stone rather than flesh and blood. This enduring belief in the pharaoh's divinity, in earthly eternity attained, is perhaps their most lasting legacy. Long after their tombs were looted and bodies scattered, the pharaohs are still with us, resurrected in our history books and museum galleries. We still speak their names: Khufu, Nefertiti, Hatshepsut, Tutankhamun, and marvel at their monuments. They built for eternity, and in many ways they achieved it, though not as they might have imagined. For the pharaohs, eternal life was a given, a birthright of their divine status. For their subjects, the afterlife had to be earned through service, both in this life and the next. This fundamental divide, the chasm between the god-kings and the rest of humanity, is what makes their world at once so dazzling and so alien to our eyes. It was a world where one person, by accident of birth, could command the living and the dead, move mountains and rivers, and shape the very landscape of eternity. That was the power and the burden of the pharaohs, the sun-sons of ancient Egypt, who lived, ruled, and died as gods on earth. And yet, for all their power and splendor, the pharaohs were still mortal men and women. They suffered from the same human frailties: disease, injury, family drama, political intrigue. They just did so on a much grander scale, befitting their exalted status. This is perhaps what makes them so endlessly fascinating, so ripe for continual study and speculation. They were larger than life, but still life-sized. Untouchable gods, but still flesh and blood. In the end, maybe this is what draws us back again and again to the lives of the pharaohs. They built the pyramids and great sphinx, grand temples and hidden tombs, but they also loved their children, mourned their dead, and hoped for eternity. They were both extraordinarily powerful and extraordinarily human. And that, more than any monument or mummy, is their most enduring legacy. The reminder that even the most exalted among us are still one of us. Even a pharaoh, beneath the crowns and finery, the incense smoke and chanting priests, was still a person making their way in the world, looking ahead to the next. The ancient Egyptians believed that to speak the name of the dead was to make them live again. Perhaps then, we are all part of the pharaoh's afterlife, every time we tell their stories, ponder their lives, and marvel at their works. They built their tombs and pyramids to last till the end of time, and in doing so, they built themselves into the very bedrock of our history. The pharaohs may be gone, but they are not forgotten. They live on in our collective memory, as real and vivid as the paint on their tomb walls. And so we keep them, and their extraordinary, disturbing, dazzling world, alive, now and for all eternity. And so we lay the pharaohs to rest, as they were laid to rest so long ago, with reverence, with wonder, and with the whisper of their names echoing down through the ages. Sleep well, god-kings and queens of the Nile. May your car endure, your bar take flight, and your stories be told for all time. And thank you, dear listener, for accompanying us on this journey into the distant past. May the peace of the Pharaohs be with you, and may your dreams be as sweet as the lotus blossoms on the Nile. Good night. The immense power and influence wielded by the ancient Egyptian pharaohs is truly mind-boggling to contemplate, even thousands of years later. As both divine figures and absolute monarchs, these god-kings lived lives of luxury and excess that would be unimaginable to the average person. But hand in hand with their privileged status came a darker side, one full of deadly intrigues, power-hungry machinations, and disturbing practices that reveal the heavy burden and often twisted realities of sitting on the throne of Egypt. It was a gilded cage in many ways. Take, for example, the pharaoh's daily routine. While it may have been filled with the finest foods, servants attending to every whim, and leisurely pursuits like hunting, boating, and board games, it was also rigidly prescribed by religious duties and superstitious rituals. Every aspect was governed by a desire to maintain Mat, the proper order of the universe. So a pharaoh couldn't simply wake up and do as he pleased. There were temple rites to perform, offerings to make, and a pantheon of gods to appease. The Egyptians believed that the pharaoh had to carry out these rituals in order for the cycles of nature, like the life-giving Nile floods, to continue. That's a heavy responsibility to bear. Even the pharaoh's personal grooming was laden with meaning. Washing in sacred water from the Nile, shaving their heads and donning copious amounts of perfume, makeup and jewelry wasn't just about vanity. It was a way of setting themselves apart, of embodying the divine on earth. And it didn't stop at appearances. Practically every minute of a pharaoh's day was scheduled and accounted for, from petitions and offerings in the morning to touring building projects and consulting with advisors in the afternoon. Even their moments of rest and leisure in the evening were shaped by tradition and the need to be seen as more than human. The pressure to live up to this superhuman ideal must have been immense, and it bred more than a few pharaohs who, drunk on power and self-aggrandizement, took things to dark and disturbing extremes in their quest to be the supreme ruler on both earth and in the afterlife. You can see this most clearly perhaps in the kind of megalomaniac building projects that pharaohs undertook. Not content with your average tomb or memorial temple, some commanded their subjects to toil for decades on massive, glorious monuments to themselves. The Great Pyramid of Giza, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, is a perfect example. This was commissioned by the pharaoh Khufu around 2550 BC. Standing over 480 feet tall and comprised of over 2 million limestone blocks, it was the tallest man-made structure in the world for almost 4,000 years. The logistics and labor that went into building Khufu's pyramid are staggering to contemplate. Stones weighing an average of over 2 tons had to be quarried, transported, and assembled with absolute precision using only primitive copper chisels, bronze saws, wooden rollers and sleds, ramps, levers, and pulleys. Experts estimate it took over 20,000 workers and as long as 27 years to complete. And for what? All to house the corpse of one man and ensure his safe passage to the afterlife. It's an astounding, and some would say appalling, display of power and self-aggrandizement. Not to mention that life was incredibly harsh for the armies of workers who built pyramids like Khufu's. They may not have been slaves, as popular lore often suggests, but the back-breaking work took a serious toll. Scans of skeletal remains from the workers' cemetery show high rates of arthritis, injuries, and stress. Pyramid building eventually fell out of favor, perhaps becoming too costly and time-consuming even for the pharaohs. But the rich and powerful still found other ways to flaunt their wealth in the face of death. Take King Tutankhamun, the famed boy king who ruled in the 14th century BC. While he died young and had a relatively short reign, his golden death mask and opulent grave goods have become enduring symbols of ancient Egypt's wealth and splendor. When Howard Carter unsealed King Tut's small tomb in 1922, he found room after room stuffed to the brim with a dazzling array of over 5,000 priceless objects. Golden shrines, jewel-encrusted chests, intricately carved furniture, chariots, clothes, perfumes, and even food and wine to sustain Tut in the afterlife. The sensational discovery ignited a wave of Tutmania around the world and introduced millions to the glories of ancient Egypt. But it also highlights the phenomenal excess enjoyed by the pharaohs, even the minor ones like Tutankhamun. Some rulers took it even further, burying loyal subjects with them to serve them in death as they had in life. This is a practice known as retainer sacrifice, and evidence for it has been found in some of the earliest royal tombs, going back to the First Dynasty, around 3000 BC. In tombs at the royal burial ground of Abydos, archaeologists discovered the remains of court officials, servants, and even dogs arrayed around the pharaoh's sarcophagus and subsidiary graves. It seems these unlucky attendants were sacrificed to continue their duties in the afterlife, a disturbing reflection of how much the pharaoh's power extended beyond the grave. Thankfully, this practice seems to have largely died out by the Old Kingdom period, but the fact that it was ever condoned at all is a chilling reminder of the absolute godlike power ancient Egyptians invested in their kings. Even as mummification techniques became more and more refined, and the fabled Valley of the Kings filled with hidden tombs, the gulf between the pharaoh's eternal comfort and the lot of the average Egyptian couldn't have been starker. While the royals enjoyed gold, jewels, and linen wrappings in the afterlife, most people had to make do with a simple pit grave and a few humble trinkets, if that. The inequality was so stark, it's little wonder that tomb robbing became a constant scourge for Egyptian elites. Still, the promise of eternal life, however luxurious, was one that even the pharaohs couldn't always count on, as the fates of some of the most famous rulers attest. Take Ramses II, widely regarded as the greatest and most powerful pharaoh of the New Kingdom. His reign, which lasted an astonishing 66 years, from 1279 to 1213 BC, marked the peak of ancient Egypt's imperial power and prosperity. Ramses II, or Ramses the Great as he's often known, was a military leader who expanded Egypt's reach in Nubia, Libya, and the Levant. He was also a prolific builder who erected many grand temples, statues, and monuments. But for all his glory in life, Ramses II didn't exactly get the restful and dignified eternity he probably expected. His mummy has been moved and disturbed countless times over the millennia, as tomb robbers, priests, and archaeologists have all had a hand in its fate. When Ramses's mummy was finally unwrapped in 1886 by Gaston Maspero, the head of the Egyptian Antiquities Service, it was found to be in poor condition. The king's body was broken into pieces, many bones were missing, and a gaping hole in the skull suggested the work of ancient looters. Still, with his long aquiline nose, strong jaw, and shock of white hair, Ramses was an imposing figure even in death. His mummy is now on display at the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization in Cairo, a far cry from his original resting place in the Valley of the Kings, but no less a potent symbol of his enduring power and mystique. In the end, perhaps it's this very mystique, this mix of the marvelous and the macabre, the inspiring and the unsettling, that keeps us so fascinated by the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. They were larger-than-life figures who wielded immense power and wealth, but they were also mortal men, subject to the same fears, foibles, and fates as the rest of us. Peering into their lives, their triumphs and excesses, their vanities and vulnerabilities, is like holding up a mirror to the human condition. We see the heights to which we can ascend and the depths to which we can sink. We marvel at the ingenuity and artistry of an ancient civilization, even as we recoil at some of its more disturbing practices. Most of all, we come face to face with the stark realities of power, its seductions and its pitfalls, its uses and its abuses. The pharaohs may have ruled as gods on earth, but they were also prisoners of a system that demanded constant displays of strength, piety, and conspicuous consumption. In that sense, perhaps we can even feel a twinge of sympathy for these divine rulers, trapped in their gilded cages, burdened with the weight of an entire civilization's hopes, dreams, and fears. It's a far cry from the glamorous and carefree existence we might imagine for a god king. But then again, that's the enduring allure of ancient Egypt. It defies our expectations and challenges our assumptions at every turn. It is a civilization that was at once familiar and alien, majestic and monstrous, enlightened and benighted. And the pharaohs, for all their flaws and foibles, were the avatars of this endlessly fascinating world. They may have lived and died thousands of years ago, but their stories, their secrets, and their splendors continue to haunt us to this day. We will likely never fully unravel all the mysteries of the pharaohs and their world, but that doesn't stop us from trying. From poring over every scrap of papyrus, studying every mummy and monument, sifting through every grain of desert sand for clues to their lives and times. In a way, that's the greatest legacy of the pharaohs, not the pyramids or the golden treasures, but the enduring sense of wonder and curiosity they inspire in us, the tantalizing glimpse they offer into a world at once vanished and vivid, lost and everlasting. So perhaps the real question is not what we can learn from the pharaohs, but what we can learn about ourselves in our endless fascination with them. What does our obsession with these ancient rulers say about our own hopes, dreams, and fears? What does it reveal about our relationship to power, to death, to the eternal mysteries of the human heart? These are questions that may never have definitive answers, but they are worth pondering nonetheless, just as the pharaohs themselves continue to beguile and bewilder us, inviting us to explore ever deeper the labyrinthine recesses of their world and our own. And so, the story of the pharaohs endures, as it has for millennia, a tale of power and pathos, of glory and despair, of the eternal dance between light and shadow that defines the human condition. It is a story that will continue to be told and retold, as long as there are those who seek to peer behind the veil of history and glimpse the faces of those who once ruled as gods among men. The pharaoh would begin his morning ablutions in an ornate limestone washroom, where a small army of servants waited to assist their living god. First, they would delicately wrap him in fine linen towels and escort him to a gleaming copper bathing tub filled with water, lotus flowers floating on the surface. As he stepped in, the servants would carefully wash the pharaoh's body with natron, a mineral salt that cleansed and softened the skin. They paid special attention to his hands and feet, gently scrubbing away any dirt or impurities. After bathing, the pharaoh would be dried off, and a servant would appear bearing a tray of fragrant oils. With practiced motions, he would anoint the king from head to toe, massaging the oils into his skin until it glowed. These sacred unguents, in scents of myrrh, frankincense, and cinnamon, were believed to have magical protective properties, shielding the pharaoh from evil spirits and misfortune. A dab of black coal was carefully applied around his eyes, not just for beauty, but to deflect the harsh glare of the sun god Ra and ward off eye infections. Next came the pharaoh's iconic regalia, the crowns, scepters, and jewels that denoted his supreme status. Every item was imbued with layers of religious and political symbolism. The distinctive double crown, for example, represented the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under the pharaoh's divine rule. A designated servant would reverentially lift the lapis lazuli and gold headdress and place it atop the king's head, taking great care to arrange it just so. Then would come the crook and flail, implements of kingship often depicted crossed over the pharaoh's chest in art and sculpture. The crook symbolized his role as shepherd of his people, while the flail represented his ability to mete out punishment to enemies of the state. Once adorned, the pharaoh would emerge from his chambers to greet the day, a glittering vision inspiring both reverence and terror. But this was only the beginning of a grueling daily routine that left little room for rest. First on the agenda was worship and offering rituals at the temple, where the pharaoh would honor the gods and elevate his own divine status. At the heart of every Egyptian temple was the inner sanctum where a statue of the chief god resided. Only the pharaoh and the high priests were allowed to enter this sacred space and perform the daily rites. The king would prostrate himself before the god's image, reciting prayers and burning incense. He would present lavish offerings of food, drink, clothing, and jewelry, symbolically giving the god all the best produce of the land. In return, the deity would bestow divine favor and protection on Egypt and empower the pharaoh to rule wisely and defeat his enemies. This sacred transaction between the king and the gods was the bedrock of Egyptian cosmic order. But it was also a daily reinforcement of the pharaoh's precarious position. His people believed his piety and right conduct literally sustained the cycles of the sun, the Nile floods, and the agricultural bounty of the kingdom. It was a heavy responsibility to shoulder day in and day out. With his religious duties complete, the pharaoh would begin the real work of governing, a task he largely delegated to his most trusted advisors. The pharaoh's prime minister, known as the vizier, oversaw the sprawling administrative apparatus that kept the kingdom running smoothly. A huge bureaucracy of scribes, tax collectors, and local officials managed everything from recording the Nile flood levels and grain harvests to dispensing justice in the courts. But the pharaoh was expected to take an active role in decision-making on key issues like diplomacy, trade, and monumental building projects. He would consult with his advisors in an audience chamber, seated on a golden throne flanked by statues of the falcon god Horus and the cobra goddess Wadjet. Painted on the walls around him were scenes of the pharaoh smiting foreign enemies and offering to the gods, potent reminders of his larger-than-life duties. Seated at his feet on a dais would be his great royal wife, the queen who bore the next heir to the throne. The vizier and other courtiers would bow low before the royal couple, hands raised in supplication, awaiting their orders. Messengers and petitioners would be ushered in to deliver reports on the state of the kingdom or beg boons from the pharaoh. There might be disturbing news of a military skirmish at the border requiring the king to marshal his armies, or a request to send aid to a region facing drought and famine. Diplomats from foreign lands would present tribute and tokens of respect in exchange for trade concessions and treaties. The pharaoh would hear each matter in turn, consulting with his advisors and rendering judgments with an authority that could not be questioned. Even in his leisure time, the king was performing his royal role. He would go on ceremonial hunting expeditions in the desert, firing arrows at lions and other big game from a speeding chariot. This was a demonstration of his physical prowess and mastery over the wild forces of nature. Important propaganda in a world where might made right. He would also preside over jubilant religious festivals, like the Opet festival celebrating the link between the pharaoh and the great god Amun-Ra. In a spectacular river procession, the pharaoh would accompany statues of the Theban triad of gods on a barge sailing down the Nile, as huge crowds thronged the banks to cheer them on. At the end of a long day, the pharaoh would retire to his private quarters, where he might indulge in more earthly pleasures. Many kings kept harems of secondary wives and concubines, in addition to their great royal wife. These women lived in a separate palace area, visited by the pharaoh whenever he desired. Some pharaohs, like Amenhotep III and Ramses II, had over 100 children from multiple wives, an extensive royal brood seen as a sign of the king's virility and divine favor. But even in these intimate moments, there was no escaping the religious and ritual significance woven through every aspect of the pharaoh's life. Having intercourse with his wives wasn't just a sexual act. It was a sacred rite, reenacting the creation of the cosmos by the gods. The pharaoh was expected to perform in the bedroom just as he did on the throne and the battlefield. And the women who shared his bed, while pampered and privileged, also faced intense pressure to produce royal heirs, preferably sons. The stakes were high in a world where the succession of divine kingship was paramount. As the pharaoh drifted off to sleep, no doubt exhausted by the burdens of his exalted station, he could only hope that his efforts had pleased the gods and kept the forces of chaos at bay for another day. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove his worth as the living embodiment of divine order on earth. It was a relentless cycle, but one that each pharaoh was born and raised to fulfill, no matter the cost. Such was the disturbing life of these god kings who ruled over ancient Egypt for 3,000 years. Of course, even the most revered pharaohs were only human under all the divine trappings, and behind the palace walls, royal family drama seethed, often with devastating consequences. Rivalries between a pharaoh's wives were common, as each competed to have her son named heir to the throne. These feuds took on legendary proportions in some cases, like the rivalry between Ramses II's wife Nefertari and his secondary consort Isetanofret. Nefertari, whose beauty and influence were so great she was known as the one for whom the sun shines, had borne Ramses several sons, but none had survived to succeed him. Isetanofret saw her chance to install her own son, Meneptah, as crown prince, and worked to undermine Nefertari at every turn. The struggle came to a head when Nefertari's tomb was vandalized, her image hacked out of the wall reliefs in a blatant attempt to erase her from history and memory. Many suspected Isetanofret was behind the desecration, though nothing could be proven. In the end, despite Nefertari's unrivaled status, it was Isetanofret's son Merneptah who took the throne after Ramses' death. Such was the Game of Thrones played out in the pharaoh's court, where even the most beloved consort could fall victim to the ruthless machinations of her rivals. Even more scandalous were the rare but documented cases of incest within the royal family. The pharaohs believed their divine blood had to be kept pure at all costs, even if that meant marrying their siblings or even their own children. This practice may have reached its disturbing apex with the curious case of Akhenaten, the rebel pharaoh who upended centuries of religious tradition by proclaiming the sun disk Aten as the one true god. Akhenaten was already a strange and enigmatic figure, depicted in art with an elongated skull, spindly limbs, and feminine hips that have long puzzled scholars. But even more shocking was his unconventional choice of chief wife and queen, his own daughter, Ankhesenamun. Archaeological evidence suggests Ankhesenamun was born to Akhenaten and his first wife, Nefertiti, when they were both very young, perhaps as young as 12 years old. She would have grown up in her father's sprawling new capital city of Amarna, a surreal landscape dominated by the towering temples of the Aten sun disk. As she blossomed into a young woman, Ankhesenamun caught the eye of her father, who by then had proclaimed himself the living incarnation of the Aten and banned the worship of all other gods. In a move that must have scandalized the court, Akhenaten took his teenage daughter as his great royal wife, the pharaoh's consort who would rule by his side and bear his children. The union was immortalized in a series of intimate portraits carved into Amarna's limestone cliffs, showing the couple locked in romantic embraces, their bodies intertwined. These scenes, almost pornographic by ancient Egyptian standards, suggest an erotic charge to the relationship that went beyond mere dynastic calculation. What Ankhesenamun herself thought of her fate, we can only imagine. As a royal princess, she would have had little say in the matter. The marriage produced at least 2 daughters, but no surviving sons to inherit Akhenaten's throne. When the heretic pharaoh died after a 17-year reign, the Amarna experiment died with him. The old gods were restored, his capital abandoned, and his name erased from the king lists. The young widow Ankhesenamun vanished from the record. Her astonishing story buried until Amarna's ruins were rediscovered in the early 20th century. She has since become an object of fascination and speculation for historians, a symbol of the disturbing lengths to which some pharaohs would go to protect their godly bloodlines. Such was the strange and secretive world of the pharaoh's royal family, a hothouse of intrigue and power struggles played out against the backdrop of divine kingship. The pharaoh may have been worshipped as a god on earth, but he was also a man with all too human appetites and frailties, and those closest to him, the women and children of his household, often paid the highest price for their proximity to power. From incestuous marriages to murderous rivalries, the private lives of the pharaohs were every bit as dramatic and disturbing as their public reigns. But for all the darkness and dysfunction lurking behind palace walls, the pharaohs never lost sight of their ultimate obsession, their own divinity and immortality. From the moment they took the throne, every pharaoh was already planning for the moment they would leave it and ascend to join the gods in the eternal afterlife. And no pharaoh undertook this quest for immortality more assiduously or on a grander scale than the builder of the Great Pyramid of Giza, the legendary Khufu. Ruling in the 4th dynasty of the Old Kingdom, around 2550 BCE, Khufu was the son of the pharaoh Sneferu, who had pioneered pyramid building with his innovative, bent and red pyramids. But Khufu was determined to outdo his father and erect a monument that would stand the test of eternity. The result was the Great Pyramid, a towering edifice of 2.3 million limestone blocks, rising 481 feet into the desert sky. Even today, it remains the largest single building ever constructed by human hands, a testament to one man's monumental ego and the extraordinary lengths he would go to achieve immortality. The Great Pyramid was more than just a tomb. It was a resurrection machine designed to harness the power of the sun god Ra and the magic of Egyptian engineering to launch Khufu's spirit into the cosmic realms of the gods. Every aspect of its design was suffused with religious symbolism and funerary spells from the pyramid texts, the oldest sacred writings in Egypt. The pyramid's smooth, angled sides were clad in polished white limestone that would have made it shine like a giant prism in the desert sun, a radiant beacon guiding Khufu's soul to the heavens. Inside, a series of narrow, ascending and descending passages led to the king's burial chamber, deep in the heart of the pyramid. This was the most sacred space of all, where Khufu's mummified body would rest in a granite sarcophagus surrounded by all the treasures and supplies he would need for the afterlife. The chamber was a marvel of precision engineering, its walls lined with massive granite blocks fitted so tightly you couldn't slip a piece of paper between them. This was meant to seal the king's body and possessions away from thieves and intruders for all eternity, a secure staging ground for his journey to immortality. But building such a monumental tomb came at a staggering cost, both in resources and human lives. The Great Pyramid required a workforce of skilled masons, engineers and labourers on a scale never before seen in Egypt. Contrary to popular belief, these were not slaves but paid workers, many of them peasant farmers recruited during the annual Nile flood when their fields were underwater. They laboured in grueling conditions under the desert sun, hauling massive blocks of limestone up ramps and lever systems to construct the pyramid layer by meticulous layer. Overseeing this vast operation was the pharaoh's cousin Hemiunu, the royal architect who had designed the pyramid and now managed its construction like a military campaign. He commanded an army of overseers and foremen who pushed the workers to their limits, driven by the knowledge that the pharaoh's immortality depended on their speed and precision. Accidents and deaths were an accepted part of the job, with some workers even buried in the shadow of the pyramid they had died building. The human cost of Khufu's ambition was immense, but to the pharaoh, it was a price worth paying for eternal life. He saw himself as a divine being, a god incarnate whose spirit would live forever among the stars of the northern sky. The pyramid was his stairway to heaven, a monumental feat of will and engineering that would ensure his name and legacy endured for all time. And in a sense, he was right. 4,500 years later, we are still marveling at the Great Pyramid and the disturbing lengths to which one pharaoh went to achieve immortality. But even Khufu's audacious monument pales in comparison to the extraordinary measures some of his successors took to equip themselves for the afterlife. As the prosperity and power of the Old Kingdom waned, later pharaohs became increasingly obsessed with their own mortality and the fate of their eternal souls. They poured their dwindling resources into ever more elaborate tombs and mortuary temples, desperately trying to guarantee their place among the gods. This desperate quest for immortality reached its macabre apex with the practice of retainer sacrifice, the burial of servants alongside the pharaoh to attend him in the afterlife. The most chilling example comes from the tomb of the First Dynasty pharaoh Jer at Abydos, where archaeologists uncovered the remains of 318 individuals, men, women, and even children, who had been sacrificed and buried in neat rows outside the king's funerary enclosure. The scale of the carnage is staggering, the largest known case of human sacrifice in ancient Egypt. The victims appear to have been palace servants, members of the royal household who were selected to serve the king in death as they had in life. They were likely killed by strangulation or a blow to the head, their bodies hastily mummified and buried with minimal grave goods. Some were even interred in coffins bearing their own names, a poignant reminder of their individual identities and the violent fate that awaited them. What could have motivated such a mass slaughter? For the pharaoh and his priests, it was a natural extension of the king's divine power, his ability to command obedience and service, even beyond the grave. The servants were seen as privileged to be chosen for this sacred duty, their sacrifice a necessary part of ensuring the pharaoh's eternal well-being. But one can only imagine the terror and despair of those selected, knowing they would soon be joining their master in death. This disturbing practice appears to have been relatively short-lived, dying out by the end of the Old Kingdom. But it speaks to the incredible power and allure of the afterlife in ancient Egyptian culture, and the extreme lengths to which some pharaohs would go to secure their place in it. The idea of an eternal existence beyond death, where the pharaoh would reign supreme among the gods, was so intoxicating that it justified even the most horrific acts of violence and sacrifice. And it wasn't just human servants who. As the centuries passed, ancient Egypt's New Kingdom period gave way to the Late Period, a time of foreign invasions and rule by outside powers. The Libyans, Nubians, Assyrians and Persians all took their turn at the helm, wresting control of Egypt from native pharaohs. But perhaps no foreign power left quite as indelible a mark as Alexander the Great and the Greek Macedonian Ptolemaic dynasty he left in his wake. In 332 BC, Alexander the Great swept into Egypt, wresting it from Persian control. After being crowned pharaoh in Memphis, he founded the great seaside city of Alexandria, soon to become a cosmopolitan center of Greek culture and learning. But Alexander's reign as pharaoh was cut short by his untimely death in 323 BC. In the chaotic aftermath, his general Ptolemy Wunsota seized control of Egypt, installing himself as the first pharaoh of the Ptolemaic dynasty that would rule for the next 275 years. The Ptolemaic pharaohs were a fascinating fusion of Greek and Egyptian culture. They adopted many Egyptian royal traditions and religious practices to legitimize their rule in the eyes of their subjects. Ptolemy III's son and successor, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, even instituted worship of the deified Alexander, cleverly positioning the Ptolemies as successors to Alexander's divine rule. Yet at the same time, the Ptolemies remained resolutely Greek, marrying their siblings in the Egyptian royal tradition, but giving their children Greek names and hiring Greek architects to reshape Alexandria's landscape in the style of their homeland. One of the most audacious Ptolemaic building projects was surely the Pharaohs lighthouse, constructed on the orders of Ptolemy I Soter. Standing an astonishing 330 feet tall, this wonder of the ancient world guided ships into Alexandria's harbour with its blazing fire at night. The Ptolemies also built grand temples in the traditional Egyptian style, like the Temple of Horus at Edfu and the Temple of Isis on the island of Philae. But they added their own Greek flourishes, inscribing their names in hieroglyphs, but also Greek on temple walls. The most famous Ptolemaic pharaoh of all was of course Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of ancient Egypt. But the Ptolemaic dynasty's notorious incestuous marriages produced more than one ambitious, powerful queen over the centuries. Take Berenice II, wife of Ptolemy III Euergetes. When her husband left to fight in the Third Syrian War in 246 BC, Berenice vowed to the goddess Aphrodite that she would cut off her long, luxurious hair if Ptolemy returned home safely. And she made good on her promise, placing her shorn tresses in Aphrodite's temple. The hair later mysteriously vanished, but court astronomer Conon of Samos, perhaps trying to get back in the queen's good graces, claimed that Aphrodite had been so touched by the offering that she placed Berenice's hair in the sky as the constellation Coma Berenices, or Berenice's hair. The Ptolemaic pharaohs were also no strangers to court intrigues and power struggles. One of the most dramatic examples came after the death of Ptolemy IV in 204 BC. His young son Ptolemy V, not even 6 years old, was next in line for the throne. But the boy king's regents, Agathocles and Sosibius, weren't about to give up their influence and power. They did the unthinkable, having the young pharaoh's mother, Arsinoe, murdered to secure their own positions. The common people, who had loved Queen Arsinoe, were outraged when they got wind of the sordid plot. They besieged the royal palace, dragging Agathocles and his family out and lynching them in the street. The grisly scene was a stark reminder that while the Ptolemaic pharaohs styled themselves as god kings, they were all too human and vulnerable to the wrath of their subjects. The Ptolemaic era was a time when much of the ancient Egyptian culture and religion we know today was compiled and recorded for posterity. The Ptolemies were great patrons of the arts, sciences, and literature. It was at the Great Library of Alexandria that Manetho, an Egyptian priest and historian, wrote his Egyptiaca. This 3-volume work, now largely lost, compiled the first comprehensive list of Egyptian pharaohs and divided their reigns into 30 dynasties. The framework we still use to parse ancient Egyptian chronology today, and it was under the Ptolemies that the Egyptian priest scribe Hor of Sebennytos penned a fascinating papyrus that has come to be known as the Dream Book. This enigmatic text lists nearly 200 different dreams and their supposed meanings. Some are rather mundane, like dreaming of eating figs, indicating the dreamer will come into money. But others are more sinister omens, like dreaming of being burned alive, signaling great danger ahead. The Ptolemaic dynasty ended with the tragic demise of its most famous queen, Cleopatra VII, in 30 BC. After picking the losing side in the Roman Civil War between Mark Antony and Octavian, Cleopatra took her own life, allegedly by the bite of a poisonous asp, rather than be paraded through the streets of Rome as a war trophy. With Cleopatra's death, the long line of divine pharaohs finally came to a close, and Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire. But the 3,000-year legacy the pharaohs left behind still endures. Every magnificent monument, every golden tomb treasure, every tall tale recorded on temple walls or papyrus scrolls has kept their larger-than-life stories alive. The pharaohs built ancient Egypt into a flourishing civilization that has captured imaginations for millennia, and will likely continue to do so for as long as the pyramids still stand. The mystique of the pharaohs lies in how, even at the distance of thousands of years, they still seem to straddle the line between gods and mortals, the natural and supernatural. The truth is, the pharaohs were both extraordinary and all too human. They performed mind-boggling feats of engineering, artistic, and cultural achievement that have rarely been matched. But they could also be petty, superstitious, ruthless, and tyrannical. They were a bundle of fascinating contradictions, chasing immortality while grappling with all the flaws and frailties of being human. So perhaps that's why, for all their power and pomp, the pharaohs still speak to us today. Their outsized lives are like monuments to the human condition itself, the soaring triumphs and the devastating lows that have defined the mortal experience since the dawn of civilization. The life of a pharaoh was one of immense power and privilege, but also one governed by strict religious duties and rituals. From the moment he awoke in his opulent palace, a pharaoh's day was meticulously planned and scheduled, with little room for spontaneity or personal indulgence. The pharaoh's morning routine was an elaborate affair, with teams of servants attending to his every need. He would be washed, perfumed, and dressed in fine linens before donning the various crowns and symbols of his divine office. The distinctive double crown, or pshent, combined the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, symbolizing the pharaoh's dominion over the unified land. But even in these mundane morning rituals, there was an undercurrent of magic and superstition. The pharaoh's clothing was imbued with powerful symbolism and believed to confer divine protection. Every cosmetic and item of jewelry had deep spiritual significance. Even the pharaoh's daily ablutions were a sacred rite, with priests reciting spells and incantations as sacred water from the Nile was poured over his head. With his regalia in place, the pharaoh would then consume a light breakfast before beginning his packed schedule of daily duties. As the earthly embodiment of the god Horus, one of the pharaoh's most vital roles was as the supreme religious leader of Egypt. He was responsible for maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic order and balance, through his divine intercession with the gods. This meant that a significant portion of the pharaoh's day was taken up with religious ceremonies and temple rituals. He would make offerings to the gods, perform libations, and recite the necessary incantations to ensure the continued favor of the divine realm. These rituals were not just symbolic, but were believed to have a real and tangible impact on the prosperity and stability of Egypt. But the pharaoh was not just a religious figurehead. He was also the supreme political ruler of one of the most powerful empires of the ancient world. After his religious duties were complete, he would hold court and meet with his advisors to discuss matters of state. The pharaoh had the final say on all issues of law, taxation, trade, and foreign policy. He would also hear petitions from his subjects and dispense justice as he saw fit. The concept of Ma'at extended to social order as well as cosmic balance, and the pharaoh was the ultimate arbiter of this earthly harmony. His word was quite literally law, and his judgments were considered infallible and incontestable. However, even with all of these weighty responsibilities, the pharaoh still had time for leisure and pursuits befitting his exalted status. He might go hunting in the lush marshes along the Nile, or enjoy a sumptuous banquet with his courtiers and foreign dignitaries. Some pharaohs, like Amenhotep II, were known for their athletic prowess and would showcase their skills in archery or chariot racing. But even in these moments of relaxation, the pharaoh was never truly at ease. His life was governed by a strict code of behavior and a constant awareness of his divine role. Every action, every word, every decision was freighted with meaning and consequence. And beneath the surface of this gilded existence lurked a darker undercurrent of superstition, magic, and brutality. The pharaoh may have been the most powerful man in Egypt, but he was also the most vulnerable to the capricious whims of the gods and the machinations of his enemies. Jealous rivals, both within the royal family and among the nobility, constantly plotted and schemed to overthrow him. Sorcerers and magicians employed curses and hexes to bring about his downfall. Even the common people, though they revered the pharaoh as a living god, could turn against him if they felt he had failed in his divine duties. To protect against these myriad threats, both real and supernatural, the pharaoh relied on a complex web of magic and ritual. He wore amulets and talismans imbued with protective spells, and his food and drink were tested for poison by trusted servants. His palace was warded against evil spirits, and his bedchamber was guarded by the most loyal and fearsome of his warriors. But even with all of these precautions, the life of a pharaoh was a precarious one. The annals of Egyptian history are filled with the stories of pharaohs who met untimely and often gruesome ends, from assassination and warfare to disease and dark sorcery. In the end, the pharaoh was as much a prisoner of his divine role as he was its beneficiary. For all of his power and privilege, he was ultimately a slave to the crushing weight of tradition, superstition, and the unyielding expectations of his gods and his people. The life of a pharaoh was indeed a gilded cage, opulent and glittering on the outside, but constricting and suffocating within. And yet, for all of its dangers and drawbacks, the allure of the pharaonic crown was an irresistible one. The chance to wield such godlike power, to shape the course of an empire, to have one's name etched into eternity, these were temptations that few could resist. And so the cycle continued, from one pharaoh to the next, each one striving to outdo his predecessors in grandeur and glory, even as the shadow of mortality and the fickle favour of the gods loomed ever larger. Such was the burden and the blessing of the pharaohs, the god-kings of ancient Egypt, whose lives and legacies continue to fascinate and enthrall us to this day. But the pharaonic crown was a heavy one, both literally and figuratively. The great golden headdresses and crowns worn by the pharaohs could weigh up to 5 pounds, a physical reminder of the weighty responsibilities they carried. And for all of their divine status and earthly power, the pharaohs were still mortal men, subject to the same fears, frailties, and vices as any other. Perhaps nowhere was this more evident than in the royal court, where the pharaoh was surrounded by a vast retinue of family, advisors, courtiers, and servants. While the pharaoh may have been the supreme ruler of Egypt, he still had to navigate the treacherous waters of court politics and intrigue on a daily basis. At the center of this was the royal family itself. The pharaoh typically had multiple wives, including a chief queen who held a special status and would bear the pharaoh's heir. But he also had a vast harem of lesser wives and concubines, many of whom were foreign princesses sent as diplomatic gifts to cement alliances with other nations. This complex web of marriages and liaisons was not just about pleasure or politics. It was also driven by a deep-seated obsession with preserving the purity and divinity of the royal bloodline. The Egyptians believed that the pharaohs were literal descendants of the gods, and that this divine essence was passed down through the generations. To maintain this purity, the pharaohs often married within their own family, taking their sisters, daughters, and even their own mothers as wives. This practice of royal incest may seem shocking and abhorrent to modern sensibilities, but for the ancient Egyptians it was a sacred duty, a way of keeping the divine blood of the pharaohs untainted by mortal influence. Of course, this incestuous inbreeding often had the opposite effect, leading to genetic defects, deformities, and a host of health problems for the royal family. The mummies of several pharaohs, including the famous King Tutankhamun, show clear signs of congenital disabilities and chronic illnesses that were likely the result of generations of close familial marriages. But for the pharaohs, the risks of incest were outweighed by the perceived benefits of preserving their divine status. And in a society where the pharaoh was seen as a living god, there was no higher priority than maintaining the purity and power of the royal line. This obsession with divine kingship also had profound implications for the role of women in ancient Egyptian society. While women in general had more rights and freedoms than in many other ancient cultures, the power of the pharaonic throne was still very much a male domain. There were, however, a few notable exceptions to this rule. Perhaps the most famous of these was Hatshepsut, a queen who took on the full powers and regalia of a pharaoh and ruled Egypt in her own right for over 2 decades. Hatshepsut was a master politician and propagandist, commissioning statues and monuments that depicted her as a powerful and legitimate ruler, complete with the traditional false beard worn by male pharaohs. She even went so far as to have herself portrayed as a male in many of her official depictions, a way of asserting her divine right to rule. But Hatshepsut's reign was the exception rather than the rule, and her successor Thutmose III went to great lengths to erase her memory and her monuments after her death. For the most part, the divine kingship of the pharaohs remained a strictly masculine affair, with women relegated to supporting roles as queens, mothers, and daughters. This gender imbalance also extended to the royal succession, which was often a bloody and brutal affair. While the pharaonic crown typically passed from father to son, there was no formal system of primogeniture, and rival princes and factions would often vie for power in the event of an unclear or contested succession. These power struggles could turn deadly, with rivals resorting to assassination, exile, or outright civil war to seize the throne. The most famous example of this was perhaps the mysterious death of Tutankhamun, who many historians believe was murdered by his advisor and successor, in order to clear the path for his own ascension. Even when the succession was clear, the new pharaoh often faced challenges and threats to his rule from within his own family. Brothers, uncles, and cousins who had been passed over for the throne might plot and scheme to overthrow the new king, while disgruntled nobles and regional governors could use their wealth and influence to foment rebellion and unrest. To counter these threats, the pharaohs relied on a combination of political savvy, military might, and divine propaganda. They would reward loyal followers with titles, lands, and wealth, while ruthlessly suppressing any signs of dissent or disloyalty. They would also go to great lengths to emphasize their own divine status and right to rule, commissioning grand monuments and temples that celebrated their godly power and accomplishments. But even the mightiest pharaoh was still mortal, and the spectre of death loomed large over the royal court. The Egyptians believed that the pharaoh's divine essence would live on in the afterlife, where he would join the gods in an eternal paradise. But to achieve this immortality, the pharaoh's body had to be preserved and protected, along with all the trappings of his earthly power and status. This belief in the afterlife was the driving force behind the construction of the Great Pyramids, the massive tombs that have become synonymous with ancient Egyptian culture. These monumental structures were not just grand displays of wealth and power. They were also elaborate machines designed to launch the pharaoh's soul into the heavens and ensure his eternal life among the gods. The process of preparing a pharaoh for the afterlife was a long and elaborate one, beginning even before his death. As soon as a new pharaoh took the throne, work would begin on his tomb and mortuary temple, which could take decades to complete. The pharaoh would be intimately involved in the planning and design of these structures, choosing the location, the layout, and the decorative program that would adorn the walls. At the same time, the pharaoh would begin accumulating the vast array of grave goods and treasures that would accompany him into the afterlife. These could include everything from furniture and clothing to jewelry and weapons, as well as huge stockpiles of food and drink to sustain the pharaoh on his journey. But perhaps the most vital component of the pharaoh's afterlife preparations was the process of mummification, which would transform his mortal body into an eternal vessel for his divine spirit. This was a long and complex process that could take up to 70 days to complete, involving the removal of internal organs, the desiccation of the body with natron salts, and the careful wrapping of the corpse in layers of linen bandages. The mummification process was overseen by a special class of priests, known as the embalmers, who worked in secret and were considered to be in direct contact with the gods. They would recite special prayers and incantations at each stage of the process, imbuing the mummy with magical spells and protections that would ensure its safe passage into the afterlife. Once the mummy was complete, it would be placed inside a series of nested coffins, each one more elaborate and expensive than the last. The outermost coffin would often be made of solid gold and adorned with intricate carvings and inlays, a fitting vessel for the divine remains of the pharaoh. The mummy and its coffins would then be transported in a grand procession to the pharaoh's tomb, where they would be sealed away in a hidden burial chamber, along with all of the pharaoh's grave goods and treasures. The tomb itself would be filled with even more offerings and artifacts, as well as elaborate frescoes and carvings depicting the pharaoh's journey into the afterlife. But even with all of these elaborate preparations, the pharaohs were not content to leave their eternal fate to chance. Many of them became obsessed with the construction of their tombs, pouring vast resources and manpower into the building of ever more elaborate monuments to their own divinity. The most famous example of this is, of course, the Great Pyramid of Giza, built by the pharaoh Khufu around 2550 BCE. This massive structure, which stood over 480 feet tall and contained more than 2 million blocks of limestone, was the tallest man-made structure in the world for over 3,800 years. The construction of the Great Pyramid was a monumental undertaking that required the labor of thousands of workers over the course of decades. The logistics of the project were staggering, involving the quarrying, transportation, and precise placement of millions of tons of stone, all without the benefit of modern machinery or technology. But for Khufu, the pyramid was more than just a feat of engineering. It was a symbol of his divine power and a guarantee of his eternal life. The pyramid was designed to align with the stars, with shafts pointing towards the constellations of Orion and Sirius, which the Egyptians believed to be the celestial homes of the gods Osiris and Isis. Inside the pyramid, Khufu's mummy would have been placed in a granite sarcophagus in the heart of the structure, surrounded by treasure and protected by a complex system of passages, chambers, and booby traps designed to thwart would-be tomb robbers. But even with all of these precautions, the pharaoh's tombs were not immune to the depredations of thieves and vandals. Over the centuries, many of the great pyramids and tombs were broken into and looted, their treasures stolen, and their mummies desecrated. This was a fate that befell even the most famous of the pharaohs, including Tutankhamun, whose tomb was discovered largely intact in 1922, but had still been entered and robbed at least twice in antiquity. The pharaoh's obsession with the afterlife, it seems, was matched only by the greed and determination of those who sought to plunder their eternal resting places. But the pharaoh's preparations for the afterlife were not limited to their own tombs and treasures. In a practice that seems shocking and horrifying to modern sensibilities, some pharaohs were buried along with servants, courtiers, and even pets, all of whom were sacrificed in order to accompany their master into the afterlife. The most extreme example of this practice was found in the tomb of the first dynasty pharaoh Jer at Abydos. where archaeologists discovered the remains of 318 individuals who had been sacrificed and buried alongside the pharaoh. These included servants, guards, and even women and children, some of whom showed signs of strangulation or blunt force trauma. This practice of human sacrifice was not limited to the early dynasties either. The tomb of the 12th dynasty pharaoh Amenemhat III at Hawara contained the remains of at least 5 young women who had been sacrificed and buried with the pharaoh, along with a menagerie of animals, including a monkey, a dog, and several ducks. Even more bizarre was the discovery of tens of thousands of human hair wigs in the tomb of the 18th dynasty pharaoh Amenhotep II. These wigs, which were made from the hair of young girls and women, were apparently intended to provide the pharaoh with a ready supply of fresh hair in the afterlife, a symbol of his eternal youth and virility. These disturbing practices speak to the incredible power and influence of the pharaohs, as well as the deeply ingrained beliefs and superstitions that governed ancient Egyptian society. For the pharaohs, the afterlife was not just a vague hope or a religious abstraction. It was a very real and tangible goal, one that demanded the utmost preparation and sacrifice. But as Egyptian society evolved and changed over the centuries, so too did the practices surrounding the pharaohs' burials. By the time of the New Kingdom, human sacrifice had largely fallen out of favor, replaced by symbolic offerings and the use of Shabti figurines, small statues that were believed to come to life and serve the pharaoh in the afterlife. And as the power of the pharaohs began to wane in the later dynasties, so too did the grandeur and scale of their tombs. The last of the Great Pyramid builders was the 12th dynasty pharaoh Amenemhat III, and by the time of the New Kingdom, the Pharaoh. As we've seen, the lives of the pharaohs were a complex tapestry woven from the threads of divine power, mortal excess, and an unshakable fixation on the afterlife. But perhaps no pharaoh embodies these themes quite as vividly as Ramses II, also known as Ramses the Great. Born around 1303 BCE, Ramses was the third pharaoh of the 19th dynasty, and he would go on to become the most celebrated and most prolific builder in all of ancient Egyptian history. He ruled for an astonishing 66 years, fathered over 100 children, and left an indelible mark on the landscape of Egypt with his colossal building projects. From the moment he took the throne, Ramses set out to immortalize his legacy in stone. He didn't just build temples and monuments, he built cities. His capital, Ramses, was a sprawling metropolis in the Nile Delta, adorned with lush gardens, stately palaces, and of course, towering statues of Ramses himself. The city was a testament to Ramses' wealth, power, and unrivaled ego. But Ramses didn't just build on a grand scale. He built with a singular purpose: to ensure his own glorification and immortality. Every temple, every obelisk, every statue was emblazoned with his name and his image. He even went so far as to carve his own likeness into existing monuments, often over the names of previous pharaohs. In Ramses' world, there was room for only one god on earth, and that god was Ramses. Of course, all this self-aggrandizement didn't come cheap. Ramses' building projects required vast amounts of labor and resources, much of it carried out by slaves and prisoners of war. The lives of these workers were hard and often short, spent toiling in the blistering heat of the desert sun. But to Ramses, their suffering was a small price to pay for the glory of his eternal legacy. And what a legacy it was! From the magnificent temples of Abu Simbel to the sprawling complex of Karnak, Ramses left his mark on nearly every corner of Egypt. His reign saw military triumphs like the Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites, as well as monumental building achievements like the completion of the Great Hypostyle Hall at Karnak, a forest of 134 massive columns covering an area of 54,000 square feet. But perhaps Ramses' most enduring legacy is the very fact that we know so much about him at all. With his relentless self-promotion and larger-than-life persona, Ramses ensured that his name would live on long after his death. And live on it has. Ramses remains one of the most famous and recognizable figures from the ancient world, a towering symbol of the power and majesty of the pharaohs. Of course, not all pharaohs were as successful in their quest for immortality as Ramses. Take, for example, the curious case of Akhenaten, the so-called heretic king who ruled during the 18th dynasty. Akhenaten is best known for his radical religious reforms, in which he abandoned the traditional pantheon of Egyptian gods in favor of a single deity, the Aten, represented by the solar disk. Akhenaten's devotion to the Aten was all-consuming. He built a new capital city, Akhetaten, dedicated solely to the worship of his one true god. He changed his name from Amenhotep IV to Akhenaten, meaning devoted to Aten. He even altered the traditional style of Egyptian art, eschewing the rigid, formalized depictions of pharaohs and gods in favor of a more naturalistic, almost androgynous style. But Akhenaten's religious revolution was short-lived. After his death, his successors quickly abandoned Akhetaten and returned to the old gods, going so far as to deface and dismantle Akhenaten's monuments and temples. His name was struck from the records, his legacy all but erased. In the end, Akhenaten's single-minded devotion to his god led not to immortality, but to obscurity. And then there's the sad story of Tutankhamun, better known to us as King Tut. Tutankhamun is perhaps the most famous pharaoh of all time, thanks in large part to the stunning discovery of his intact tomb in 1922. But the life of this young king was marked by tragedy from the very start. Tutankhamun was born into a royal family in crisis. His father was none other than Akhenaten, and his mother was likely Akhenaten's own sister. Inbreeding was not uncommon among the Egyptian royalty, who believed that keeping the royal bloodline pure was essential to maintaining their divine status. But it also led to a host of genetic problems, including the congenital defects that plagued Tutankhamun throughout his short life. When Tutankhamun took the throne around the age of 9, he inherited a kingdom in chaos. Akhenaten's religious reforms had alienated the powerful priesthood and destabilized the country. Tutankhamun's advisors, including the Vizier I and the General Horemheb, set about restoring the old order, reopening the temples, and re-establishing the cult of Amun. But Tutankhamun himself was a frail and sickly child, beset by a host of physical ailments. He suffered from a cleft palate, a clubbed foot, and a severe overbite. He walked with a cane and may have even suffered from a rare genetic disorder called Klippel-Feil syndrome, which causes the fusion of the vertebrae in the neck. Despite his physical limitations, Tutankhamun did his best to fulfill his duties as pharaoh. He oversaw the restoration of the old temples and commissioned new building projects, including his own tomb in the Valley of the Kings. But his reign was cut tragically short. Tutankhamun died around the age of 19, possibly from an infection caused by a broken leg. The story of Tutankhamun is a poignant reminder of the human frailty that lurked behind the facade of divine power. For all their wealth and influence, the pharaohs were still mortal men, subject to the same flaws and weaknesses as the rest of us. And yet, through the enduring legacy of their tombs and their treasures, they achieved a kind of immortality after all, not as gods, but as enduring symbols of a fascinating and mysterious world that continues to captivate us to this day. As we've journeyed through the lives of these legendary rulers, from the excesses of Ramses to the enigma of Akhenaten to the tragedy of Tutankhamun, one thing becomes clear. The pharaohs were as complex and multifaceted as the civilization they ruled. They were gods and men, builders and destroyers, visionaries and tyrants. They lived lives of unimaginable splendor and opulence, but they were also haunted by the specter of death and the relentless pursuit of immortality. In the end, perhaps it is this very complexity that makes the pharaohs so endlessly fascinating to us. They were not just historical figures, but mythic archetypes, embodying the timeless themes of power, ambition, and the search for meaning in the face of mortality. And through the enduring legacy of their monuments and their stories, they continue to speak to us across the millennia, whispering secrets of a world long vanished but never truly lost. As we marvel at the pyramids and the temples, the golden masks and the hieroglyphic inscriptions, we are reminded of the indomitable human spirit that drove these ancient kings to reach for the stars. And we are humbled by the realization that, for all their godlike power, they were ultimately as mortal as the rest of us, subject to the same joys and sorrows, triumphs and tragedies that define the human experience. So let us pay tribute to the pharaohs, those towering figures who shaped the course of history and left an indelible mark on the sands of time. Let us remember them not just as distant mythical figures, but as flesh and blood human beings, with all their flaws and foibles, their dreams and their despairs. And let us learn from their stories, both the inspiring and the cautionary, as we navigate our own paths through the shifting sands of life. For in the end, the legacy of the pharaohs is not just a matter of bricks and mortar, gold and granite. It is a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, to our unquenchable thirst for meaning and purpose, for beauty and transcendence. And it is a reminder that, no matter how mighty we may become, we are all part of a tapestry far greater and more enduring than any one of us can ever hope to be. So let us give thanks for the pharaohs and for all those who came before and after them, who strived and struggled and left their mark upon the world. And let us carry their stories with us as we venture forth into the unknown, armed with the wisdom of the ages and the courage of our convictions. For in the end, the measure of a life is not in the splendor of its monuments or the grandeur of its tombs, but in the love and compassion we show to one another, and in the legacy of hope and resilience we leave behind. And in this, the pharaohs, for all their flaws and failings, have much to teach us still. As we delve deeper into the shadowy world of the pharaohs, we must also acknowledge the intricate web of royal relationships and rivalries that shape their lives and legacies. Behind the gilded facades of the palaces, a complex tapestry of family dynamics, political alliances, and power struggles played out, often with devastating consequences. At the heart of the royal household was the pharaoh's inner circle of queens, concubines, and children. While the pharaoh was the supreme ruler, his queens could wield significant influence, particularly if they bore him a male heir. The great royal wife, or chief queen, held a privileged position and might even rule as regent if the pharaoh died before his successor came of age. Such was the case with Hatshepsut, who boldly assumed the full powers and regalia of a pharaoh herself, after the death of her husband, Thutmose II. But alongside these influential queens were countless lesser wives and concubines who populated the royal harem. These women, often from noble families or foreign princesses sent to cement diplomatic ties, vied for the pharaoh's favor and the chance to bear his children. The royal court buzzed with gossip, intrigue, and shifting alliances as different factions jockeyed for position. Most disturbing of all were the instances of incest that occurred within the royal family. Pharaohs often married their own sisters or half-sisters, and occasionally even their daughters, to keep the royal bloodline pure. It was believed that the pharaoh, as a living god, could only beget a legitimate heir through union with another divinity, even if that meant keeping it in the family. This practice may have contributed to genetic disorders and abnormalities in some royal offspring. Of course, not all royal siblings married each other. Some rivalries between princes and princesses burned red hot, exploding into murderous power grabs. Take, for example, the suspected plot by Ramses III's secondary wife Tiye to assassinate the pharaoh and install her own son, Pentawere, on the throne instead of the chosen crown prince Ramses IV. Ancient papyrus court records paint a chilling picture of a harem conspiracy that ended in convictions and executions. Even the legendary Cleopatra VII, last of the Ptolemaic dynasty, was no stranger to ruthless family rivalries. She allegedly had her own younger sister Arsinoe IV murdered to solidify her claim to the throne. In a world where royal blood was both a ticket to power and a reason to be eliminated by one's rivals, perhaps the frequent depictions of the pharaoh smiting his enemies take on an even darker meaning. But beyond the backstabbing intrigues of the royal court, the pharaoh's family relationships could also be touchingly human. Ramses II, for instance, honored his chief queen Nefertari with a lavishly decorated tomb and a magnificent temple at Abu Simbel. And even the oft-vilified Akhenaten, who upended Egyptian religion and art during his reign, is shown in tender scenes with his wife Nefertiti and their daughters. In the end, perhaps these familial bonds offered a bit of solace and sanity in the gilded cage of the royal palace. But make no mistake, being a pharaoh's relative was a double-edged sword that could cut short even the most regal life. From the incestuous unions to the cutthroat rivalries, the twisted family trees of the pharaohs bore strange and often poisonous fruit. The royal family was the most exclusive club in ancient Egypt, and possibly the most dangerous. As we turn now to examine the pharaoh's exalted role as a living god on earth, keep in mind the tangled human relationships that lurked beneath that lofty, divine surface. The pharaoh may have been the sun around which the Egyptian universe revolved, but the gravity of family and political forces also yanked him in unpredictable directions, even as he strove to maintain cosmic order and harmony. In the worldview of the ancient Egyptians, the pharaoh was no mere mortal ruler. He, or in rare cases she, was a living god, the divine embodiment of the falcon-headed sky god, Horus on earth. As the intermediary between the heavenly realm of the gods and the earthly domain of humans, the pharaoh played a vital role in maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic order, balance, and justice that held chaos at bay. This concept of divine kingship elevated the pharaoh to a superhuman status and imbued his every action with cosmic significance. From the moment of his coronation, when he assumed the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, the pharaoh ceased to be fully human and became a conduit for divine power. His word was law, his decrees were the will of the gods, and his very being was sacrosanct. One of the most visible manifestations of the pharaoh's divinity were the sprawling temple complexes that dotted the land. These weren't just places of worship, they were the earthly mansions of the gods, where the pharaoh performed sacred rituals to maintain the vital link between the human and divine spheres. The grandest of these temples, like the Karnak complex in Thebes or the Luxor temple downstream, were cities unto themselves, bustling with priests, craftsmen, and servants, all dedicated to serving the pharaoh god. Within these sacred precincts, the pharaoh would make offerings, recite incantations, and perform elaborate ceremonies to appease the gods and ensure the continued flow of divine blessings. The most important of these rituals was the daily rebirth of the sun, in which the pharaoh metaphorically merged with the sun god Ra to be reborn anew each morning. By participating in this endless cycle of death and renewal, the pharaoh helped to sustain the very fabric of the cosmos. But the pharaoh's divine status wasn't just a religious concept. It had far-reaching implications for Egyptian society and politics as well. As a living god, the pharaoh had absolute authority over his subjects. His word was law, and his commands were not to be questioned. Obedience to the pharaoh was equated with piety, and rebellion against him was tantamount to sacrilege. This godlike power could be intoxicating, and some pharaohs took their divine status to disturbing extremes. Perhaps the most notorious example was Amenhotep IV, better known as Akhenaten, who upended centuries of Egyptian religious tradition by proclaiming the sun disk Aten as the one true god and himself as its sole prophet. In a burst of religious fervor, Akhenaten ordered the names and images of other gods to be erased, closed their temples, and even moved the capital to a remote desert site he called Akhenaten, or Horizon of the Aten. While Akhenaten's religious revolution was short-lived, it showcased the immense power and influence a pharaoh could wield as a divine ruler. The fact that he could single-handedly overturn the entire pantheon of Egyptian gods and impose a new state religion by sheer force of will speaks volumes about the pharaoh's godlike authority. But even in less tumultuous times, the pharaoh's divinity set him apart from the rest of Egyptian society. He was a remote, awe-inspiring figure, rarely seen in public outside of carefully stage-managed appearances. His subjects approached him with a mixture of reverence and terror, prostrating themselves in his presence and averting their eyes from his divine radiance. Even his courtiers and officials had to tread carefully, lest they overstep their bounds and incur his godly wrath. In a very real sense, the pharaoh was the linchpin that held the entire edifice of ancient Egyptian civilization together. As long as he performed his divine duties and maintained Ma'at, the cosmic order, all was well. But if he faltered or failed in his responsibilities, it could spell disaster for the whole land. A weak or ineffectual pharaoh could lead to chaos, famine, and invasion, while a tyrannical or impious one risked offending the gods and bringing down divine retribution. It's no wonder, then, that the Egyptians invested so much time, labor, and resources into exalting and glorifying their pharaohs. The colossal statues, soaring obelisks, and lavish tomb complexes were all testament to the pharaoh's superhuman status and enduring legacy. They were also a way of bolstering his divine power and reinforcing his vital role in the cosmic order. But as we'll see in the next chapter, this obsession with the pharaoh's divinity reached its apex in the very last place one might expect, the tomb. For the ancient Egyptians, death was not the end for a pharaoh, but merely a transition to an even more exalted state of being. And they would go to extraordinary, even horrifying lengths to ensure their divine ruler had everything he needed for the journey. The flickering torchlight casts an eerie glow on the rough-hewn walls of the tomb, as if the very shadows are alive with the weight of ages past. The air is thick with the acrid tang of incense and the musty odor of death, a cloying perfume that clings to the nostrils and the back of the throat. Deeper and deeper we descend into the very bowels of the earth, following in the footsteps of the pharaoh on his final journey into the afterlife. For the ancient Egyptians, death was not something to be feared, but rather a doorway to a new and glorious existence. They believed that life on earth was but a brief prelude to an eternal hereafter, where the deceased would dwell in paradise with the gods, feasting and making merry for all eternity. But to achieve this blessed state, one had to be properly prepared, both spiritually and materially. And no one was better prepared for the afterlife than the pharaohs. From the moment they ascended the throne, they began planning for their eventual demise with a single-minded focus that bordered on the obsessive. Vast resources were poured into the construction of their tombs and funerary temples, veritable cities of the dead that would serve as their eternal abodes. The most iconic of these, of course, are the Great Pyramids that loom over the Giza Plateau. These monumental structures, built during the Old Kingdom, were more than just tombs. They were cosmic engines, designed to launch the pharaoh's soul into the heavens to take its place among the stars. The pyramid's smooth, sloping sides were meant to evoke the primordial mound of creation, while its precise alignment to the cardinal points mirrored the order and symmetry of the cosmos itself. But even more vital than the tomb itself was the complex process of preparing the pharaoh's body for the afterlife. The ancient Egyptians believed that the physical form was just as important as the spiritual essence, and that the two had to be preserved together for eternity. And so, in the sacred rites of mummification, the pharaoh's corpse was transformed from a lifeless husk into a vessel for immortality. For 70 days, the body was dried and desiccated with natron salt, its organs removed and carefully preserved in canopic jars. Then, in an elaborate ritual that could take weeks, the mummy was anointed with sacred oils, wrapped in countless layers of linen bandages, and adorned with protective amulets and jewelry. The face was often covered with a lifelike mask of gold and precious stones, an idealized portrait of the pharaoh in all his divine glory. But the pharaoh's journey was far from over. Once the mummy was complete, it had to be transported to the tomb in a grand funerary procession, accompanied by priests chanting hymns and spells to ward off evil spirits. The sarcophagus was then lowered into the burial chamber, surrounded by all the grave goods the pharaoh would need in the afterlife: furniture, clothing, jewelry, even food and drink to sustain him on his eternal journey. And here is where the pharaoh's preparations took a darker, more disturbing turn. For some rulers, it wasn't enough to be buried with mere objects. They wanted to be accompanied by actual living servants, ready to attend to their every whim in the hereafter. These unfortunate souls, known as retainers, were often the pharaoh's most loyal courtiers and officials, handpicked to serve him in death as they had in life. The practice of human sacrifice was not uncommon in the early dynasties of ancient Egypt, particularly during the First Dynasty. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals numerous subsidiary burials surrounding the tombs of pharaohs like Horahar and Jer, containing the remains of servants, bodyguards, and even women and dwarves who were believed to have special powers. One of the most chilling examples comes from the tomb of King Jer at Abydos, where the remains of over 300 individuals were found buried in neat rows, like a macabre honor guard flanking the pharaoh's final resting place. Many of the bodies showed signs of strangulation or blunt force trauma, suggesting that they had been deliberately killed to accompany their ruler into the afterlife. But perhaps even more unsettling than the human sacrifices were the animal ones. Countless mummified cats, dogs, monkeys, and even lions have been found in Egyptian tombs, often lavishly wrapped and adorned like miniature pharaohs themselves. These beloved pets were believed to provide companionship and protection for their masters in the afterlife, a consolation prize of sorts for an eternity spent in the dark. And then there were the more bizarre grave goods, like the millions of human hair wigs found in some tombs. These elaborate hairpieces, made from the shorn locks of courtiers and slaves, were meant to ensure that the pharaoh always had a fresh coiffure, even in the afterlife. The ancient Egyptians believed that hair had magical properties, and that a full, luxuriant wig was a sign of vitality and power. But as the centuries passed, the practice of human sacrifice gradually fell out of favor. By the time of the New Kingdom, the idea of killing servants to serve the pharaoh in the afterlife was seen as barbaric and uncivilized. Instead, the Egyptians turned to more symbolic methods, like placing Shabti figurines in the tomb, to magically come to life and perform menial tasks for the deceased. Yet even as the physical sacrifices faded away, the psychological toll of the pharaoh's obsession with the afterlife remained. The vast resources and manpower poured into their tombs and funerary cults siphoned away wealth and labor from the living, while the idea of a ruler who could command obedience even in death cast a long shadow over Egyptian society. And in the end, For all their elaborate preparations and precautions, the pharaohs could not escape the ravages of time and tomb robbers. Many of their carefully constructed resting places were plundered and desecrated over the millennia, their mummies and grave goods scattered to the four winds. In a bitter irony, the very measures they took to ensure their immortality ended up being their undoing. But even in death, the pharaohs continue to fascinate and horrify us in equal measure. Their mummies, with their uncanny lifelike expressions and aura of ancient power, have become the stuff of legend and popular culture. And as we peer into their tombs and sarcophagi, we cannot help but feel a shiver of awe and revulsion at the lengths they went to in pursuit of eternal life. For the pharaohs, death was not the end, but merely the beginning of a new and glorious existence. But as we have seen, that existence came at a terrible cost, measured in human lives and labors. And in the end, perhaps the most disturbing thing about the pharaohs' afterlife obsession is not what it says about them, but what it says about us, and our own deep-seated fears and fascinations with the great beyond. As we emerge from the Stygian depths of the pharaohs' tombs, blinking in the harsh light of the modern day, we cannot help but feel a sense of vertigo, a disorientation at the vast gulf of time and culture that separates us from these ancient god-kings. And yet, for all their alienness and inscrutability, there is something strangely familiar about them too, a recognition of the eternal human struggle against the forces of death and decay. In our own way, we are all pharaohs, building our own metaphorical pyramids and filling our own virtual tombs with the trappings of our earthly existence. We may not command armies of servants or erect colossal monuments to our own divinity, but we are all engaged in the same basic quest for meaning and immortality in the face of the void. And so, as we bid farewell to the pharaohs and their haunted realm, let us take a moment to reflect on the enduring power of their legacy. For all their flaws and foibles, these ancient rulers left an indelible mark on human history and the human imagination, one that continues to resonate down through the ages. In the end, perhaps the most fitting tribute to the pharaohs is not the gold and grandeur of their tombs, but the simple fact that we are still talking about them, still trying to unravel the mysteries of their lives and deaths, thousands of years after they walked the earth. In a way, they have achieved the very thing they sought so desperately in life, a kind of immortality, a persistence in memory and myth that transcends the bounds of time and space. And so, let us raise a metaphorical glass to the pharaohs, those strange and terrible demigods who ruled over the sands of Egypt so long ago. May they rest in peace, secure in the knowledge that their names and deeds will never be forgotten. As long as there are those who seek to peer into the shadows of the past and grapple with the eternal questions of life, death, and what lies beyond. As we've seen, the pharaohs of ancient Egypt lived lives of luxury, power, and religious devotion unparalleled in the ancient world. But for all their godlike status and opulence, one disquieting fact remained. Even the great pharaohs could not escape the inevitability of death. And it was their obsessive preparations for the afterlife that would come to dominate much of their time, resources, and labor during their reigns. The Egyptian preoccupation with death and what lay beyond stemmed from their belief in an eternal afterlife. They envisioned a paradise where they would continue to live as they had on earth, engaging in the same daily routines and pastimes. But to achieve this immortality, great pains had to be taken to preserve the body and provide all the necessities the deceased pharaoh would need. This is where the famous Egyptian practice of mummification comes in. The elaborate process could take up to 70 days and involved removing internal organs, drying out the body with natron salt, and wrapping it in layers of linen. Performed by skilled embalmers, mummification was a vital step to ensure the pharaoh's body would remain intact for the afterlife. But a well-preserved mummy wasn't enough. the eternal pharaoh would also need food, clothing, furniture, jewelry, and entertainment to sustain and occupy them. Enter the grave goods. Tombs were packed with all manner of worldly possessions, from basic necessities to intricate works of art. The famous golden death mask of Tutankhamun is just one example of the literal treasures the pharaohs took with them. Even more important than the mummy and grave goods, however, was the tomb itself. The ancient Egyptians believed that to enter the afterlife, the pharaoh's spirit had to have a place to return to and recognize as home. This is why they expended such effort to create indestructible, impenetrable tombs filled with everything the deceased would need. We've marveled at the pyramids of Giza, but they are only the beginning when it comes to the pharaonic obsession with monumental tomb building. In the Valley of the Kings near Thebes, later pharaohs abandoned the conspicuous pyramids and instead carved their tombs deep into the mountains. These sprawling, rocky tunnel systems were designed to foil grave robbers and protect the pharaoh's spirit for all of eternity. Some pharaohs, though, took their quest for a secure and luxurious afterlife to even greater and more disturbing extremes. The tomb of King Jer from the First Dynasty was found to contain the remains of 318 men and women who had apparently been sacrificed upon his death. These retainer sacrifices were a grim practice where servants, officials, and possibly even family members gave their lives to continue serving the pharaoh in the afterlife. Thankfully, by the time of the New Kingdom, human sacrifice for the pharaoh's afterlife had fallen out of practice. But that didn't stop some from making other bizarre arrangements. Amenhotep II was found buried with millions of human hair wigs, while Ramses II was interred with his beloved pet cat. Even in death, it seems, the pharaohs were loath to give up the extravagant trappings of their divine earthly existence. Of course, for all their painstaking plans and precautions, many pharaonic tombs were looted over the centuries. The fabulous treasures of Tutankhamun's tomb only survived because it was lost and forgotten. But that doesn't take away from the fascinating and, yes, disturbing lengths the pharaohs went to in their quest to cheat death and ensure their immortality. Their tombs, mummies, and the priceless relics interred with them have given us an unparalleled glimpse into one of history's most captivating and enduring cultures. And the mummies of the mighty pharaohs are still yielding their secrets today thanks to modern archaeological science. CT scans and DNA testing are allowing us to virtually unwrap these ancient kings and queens and peer into their lives and lineages like never before. In a way, then, the pharaohs did succeed in securing their immortality, if not quite in the way they intended. Their mortal remains and belongings continue to enthrall and educate us thousands of years later. And as we unravel more mysteries of their world, we come that much closer to understanding the lives and minds of these legendary rulers who held sway over the Nile and still command our imaginations today. But no study of the pharaohs would be complete without also acknowledging some of the most famous and infamous individuals to wear the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. Legendary names like Ramses the Great, the indomitable Hatshepsut, the sun-worshipping iconoclast Akhenaten, and the bewitching Cleopatra still conjure vivid images and have come to define our popular conceptions of Egyptian royalty. Ramses II, or Ramses the Great, was a king of the 19th dynasty and one of Egypt's most celebrated builders. Reigning for an astonishing 66 years, Ramses left his mark on nearly every ancient Egyptian site still standing from Luxor to Abu Simbel. His mummy reveals a man of regal bearing, strong features, and flaming red hair, and he is believed to have fathered over 100 children in his time. Now that's a kingly legacy. And speaking of a royal family tree, one cannot forget the 18th dynasty pharaoh Akhenaten and his legendary wife Nefertiti. Coming to power around 1353 BCE, Akhenaten rocked the very foundations of Egyptian society by rejecting the traditional pantheon of gods to institute a monotheistic cult of the sun disk Aten. He even changed his name from Amenhotep IV to Akhenaten, or devoted to Aten, as part of his religious revolution. Aiding him in this spiritual shake-up was his beautiful and clever chief queen Nefertiti, whose famous painted limestone bust has come to symbolize ancient Egyptian glamour and intrigue. But the Aten experiment was short-lived. After Akhenaten's death, his son, a young king you may have heard of by the name of Tutankhamun, reversed his father's decree and restored the old gods, condemning Akhenaten to the ignoble fate of having his name struck from official records and monuments. Of course, any mention of Egyptian rulers would be incomplete without Cleopatra, the last active pharaoh and Ptolemaic queen who has become the very archetype of the irresistible temptress. But Cleopatra was much more than a mere seductress. She was a brilliant politician, speaker of 9 languages, and a shrewd strategist who captivated the likes of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Though her reign ended with the fall of Egypt to Rome, Cleopatra's legend has only grown in the centuries since. These towering figures are just a sampling of the remarkable personalities that make up the saga of ancient Egypt's god-kings and queens. Each of their lives contains enough drama, intrigue, and colour to fill volumes. But they all embodied, in one way or another, the fascinating paradox of the pharaoh, a mortal who would be God, with one foot in the earthly realm and the other in eternity. It's this captivating duality, as well as the haunting remnants of their glittering world, that continue to enthrall us and draw us back to ancient Egypt time and again. The mighty pharaohs reigned over a sophisticated civilization for some 3,000 years, shaping our notions of absolute power and leaving behind some of the most formidable monuments ever constructed. But in the end, like all of us, they too were mortal, and no amount of gold or godhood could shield them from the fate that awaits us all. Within their tombs, temples, and mummies, they left tantalizing hints of their larger-than-life existence, shot through with the universal human hopes and fears we can all recognize. And that, perhaps, is their greatest legacy of all, the eternal reminder that even the most exalted among us desire nothing more than to be remembered. As we close this chapter on the lives of the pharaohs, take a moment to reflect on all we've uncovered, the sacred and the profane, the awe-inspiring and the unsettling. These ancient god-kings have much to teach us still about power, belief, legacy, and the enduring fascination of a long-lost world we are only beginning to understand. The mighty pharaohs, in all their dazzling, dramatic, and disturbing glory, will never cease to captivate us, inviting us to unravel the mysteries of their age and our own. And the inquiring mind will always heed the call to wade deeper into the past, where these legendary rulers await with their eternal secrets. As we've seen, the ancient Egyptian pharaohs lived lives of incredible power and privilege, but also darkness and brutality. From their opulent palaces to their obsessive preparations for the afterlife, these divine rulers shaped every aspect of their kingdom's culture, religion, and history. Even today, thousands of years later, the pharaohs continue to captivate us with their larger-than-life personalities, their monumental building projects, and the enduring mysteries they left behind. New discoveries and advanced scientific techniques are allowing us to unravel their secrets like never before. From the familial relationships revealed by DNA testing of mummies to the complex trade networks traced through isotope analysis. Yet the more we learn about the pharaohs, the more we realize how much we still don't know. What was the true nature of their relationships with their queens and children? How did they really wield their immense power behind closed palace doors? What did they believe would await them in the afterlife they spent so much time and effort preparing for? These questions may never be fully answered, but that's part of what keeps us so endlessly fascinated by these towering figures of history. In a way, the pharaohs achieved their dream of immortality. not just through their elaborate tombs and mummification rituals, but through the indelible mark they left on the human imagination. From the boy king Tutankhamun to the great warrior Ramses II to the legendary beauty Cleopatra, the pharaohs continue to loom large in our collective consciousness. Their stories told and retold in countless books, movies, and documentaries. They've become more than historical figures. They've become mythic archetypes, embodying timeless themes of power, ambition, love, and death. In the end, perhaps that's the pharaoh's true legacy, not the treasure-filled tombs or awe-inspiring pyramids they left behind, but the way they've shaped our understanding of what it means to be human. Through their triumphs and failures, their brilliance and their brutality, they remind us of the heights and depths we're all capable of. The eternal human struggle to leave our mark on the world and grapple with our own mortality. So the next time you see an image of a pharaoh, whether it's the iconic death mask of Tutankhamun or a faded hieroglyph carved into an ancient temple wall, take a moment to reflect on the complex, fascinating, and often disturbing world they inhabited. And remember that even the mightiest among us are ultimately subject to the same fundamental questions and challenges that have defined the human experience for millennia. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the lives of the ancient Egyptian pharaohs. I hope you found it as enlightening and captivating as I have. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into the most fascinating chapters of human history. Ones that just might change the way you think about your own place in the grand sweep of time. Until next time, sweet dreams of sandy dunes, shimmering Nile waters, and golden burial masks gleaming in the dark.